In popular imagination, the Middle Ages are often portrayed through rose-tinted lenses, grand feasts in candlelit halls, chivalrous knights rescuing noble ladies, and quiet monasteries echoing with chants of devotion. But behind these romanticized images lies a world that was, in truth, dirty, chaotic, and often foul-smelling. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent for much of the medieval period. People rarely bathed, toilets were primitive and poorly maintained, and cities were filled with the stench of waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies. Even the wealthiest nobles and royals, living in their luxurious castles, often lived in conditions we would now consider squalid. To make matters worse, much of medieval society was gripped by myths and misconceptions about health. Many believed that bathing could open the body to harmful air, known as miasma, which was thought to cause illness. Doctors had no understanding of germs or bacteria. Sewage often ran through the streets, and rivers used for drinking water doubled as sewers. From knights returning from battle covered in filth, to monks who went months without washing, from flea-infested peasants to kings who didn't know how to use soap, medieval hygiene was a grim reality of everyday life. In this collection of 49 stories, we dive into the forgotten, uncomfortable, and sometimes shocking world of medieval cleanliness or lack thereof. You'll meet the unsung workers of dirty streets, discover the strange beliefs that shape personal care, and learn how even the most elegant castles couldn't escape the overwhelming stench of the time. This is not history as told in textbooks, it's a raw, honest look at what it really meant to live, breathe, and try to stay clean in a world where hygiene was, by all modern standards, truly awful. 1. Why medieval people rarely took baths in the quiet, muddy streets of a 14th century European town. The smell of smoke from hearths mingled with something far less pleasant, the ever-present scent of unwashed bodies, open sewage, and rotting waste. To modern ears and noses, the medieval world was a pungent place, and the most baffling fact of all, many people didn't bathe for months, sometimes even years. But before we rush to judgment, let us step back and understand why. Bathing, in the early medieval period, was not always avoided. In fact, Roman influence left behind a tradition of public bathhouses in many parts of Europe. These places were not just for cleaning, but were social centers, places of gossip, relaxation, even romance. But by the High Middle Ages, these public baths began to decline, not just because of crumbling infrastructure, but due to a shifting worldview. Water, once associated with purity, began to carry darker connotations. The rising influence of the church played a pivotal role. Physical indulgence, including bathing, was increasingly linked with vanity and sin. Bathhouses, where people often bathed naked or even together, were considered sites of moral corruption. It didn't help that many of these establishments became associated with prostitution. Religious leaders warned against frequent bathing as a temptation of the flesh and a gateway to impure thoughts. At the same time, the growing fear of disease shifted public opinion. When the Black Death ravaged Europe in the mid-1300s, many people believed that bathing, and thus opening the pores, made one more susceptible to the deadly bad air or miasma, which was thought to carry the plague. This theory, though incorrect, was the prevailing medical wisdom of the time. Instead of washing themselves with water, people turned to dry rubbing with cloths, scented oils, and the use of herbs to cover up their natural odor. Water itself was another concern. Unlike today, where we have access to filtered, running water, medieval towns and cities often relied on rivers and wells that were dangerously polluted. In many places, waste from both humans and animals flowed directly into the same streams used for washing and wind drinking. Under such conditions, it is no wonder that bathing could seem more harmful than helpful. It was not that people didn't care about cleanliness, they simply had a different understanding of what it meant to be clean. Many focused on changing their linen underclothes frequently, believing that if the linen was white and clean, the person must also be clean. They combed their hair regularly to remove lice and used sweet-smelling herbs to freshen their breath or mask body odor. Nobles and royalty might have had access to private wooden tubs, but these were luxuries, not daily habits. Heating large amounts of water and filling a tub was laborious and expensive. Of course, bathing didn't disappear entirely. In some regions and periods, it remained popular, particularly in warmer climates or among certain social classes. But on the whole, across medieval Europe, regular bathing became increasingly rare, viewed with suspicion, moral judgment, and medical caution. This seemingly strange avoidance of bathing offers a deeper insight into the medieval mind, a world shaped by religious beliefs, limited science, and practical survival in a dangerous environment. The fear of invisible forces like miasma, the warnings from the pulpit, and the lack of sanitary infrastructure all contributed to a view of water not as healing and pure, but as risky and even sinful. In a time when life was short and death ever near, people prioritized different forms of health and morality than we do today. To modern audiences, the idea of going without a bath for weeks or months seems unimaginable. But perhaps centuries from now, our own practices, our perfumes, our processed soaps, our chlorinated water will seem equally odd. History, after all, teaches us not only about others, but about the limits of our own certainty. The medieval aversion to bathing wasn't born out of laziness or ignorance, but out of the best knowledge and beliefs they had at the time. In their world, bathing wasn't just a matter of hygiene, it was a moral, spiritual, and medical decision. And like so much of the past, it makes perfect sense once we step into their shoes, even if those shoes were muddy, cracked, and smelled faintly of sheep. 2. Inside the public bathhouses of the Middle Ages, in the flickering glow of candlelight and the rising mist of hot water, the medieval public bathhouse came alive, a place of warmth, noise, and unity. Often tucked between narrow alleyways or situated near rivers and wells, these bathhouses served as a curious blend of cleansing ritual, social hub, and at times moral controversy. In an age when most homes lacked private washing facilities and access to clean, heated water was a luxury, the public bathhouse was one of the few places where commoners and nobility alike could gather to scrub off the dirt, both physical and spiritual, of daily life. Bathhouses in medieval Europe, especially during the early and high Middle Ages, were not simply places to bathe. They were communal, often co-ed, and surprisingly sophisticated. Large wooden tubs or stone pools were filled with water, sometimes hot, sometimes cold, and bathers would move between temperatures as a form of primitive hydrotherapy. Many bathhouses even had separate rooms, one for undressing, one for steam, another for soaking, and sometimes a final room for resting and drying off. Attendants worked tirelessly behind the scenes, stoking fires, filling basins, and offering basic toiletries like cloths, combs, and herbal oils. In cities like Paris, London, or Nuremberg, it wasn't uncommon for a bustling bathhouse to serve dozens of visitors at bay. But cleanliness wasn't the only thing people sought there. Bathhouses were lively social spaces. Businessmen held meetings as they soaked side by side. Friends gossiped, shared news, or told stories, the way one might at a modern cafe. Food and drink was sometimes served, and in some places musicians or entertainers were hired to provide a more luxurious atmosphere. It was not unusual to spend several hours in the bathhouse, emerging not only cleaner, but more connected to the social pulse of the town. Over time, however, these joyful places began to acquire a different reputation. The intimacy of shared bathing, often with men and women in the same room, gave rise to suspicions. In some cities, bathhouses were accused of becoming sites of vice and temptation. Prostitution, though sometimes officially banned, flourished in certain establishments, turning these once innocent centers of hygiene into morally ambiguous spaces. The church began to frown upon public bathing, linking it with sexual immorality and sin. By the late Middle Ages, regulations were imposed, bathhouses were shut down or segregated by gender, and their popularity began to wane. Another factor in their decline was fear. As Europe faced repeated waves of plagues and outbreaks, medical theories about disease began to shift. The prevailing belief in miasma, or bad air, suggested that steam and warmth, both present in bathhouses, opened the body's pores, making one more vulnerable to illness. Bathhouses, once associated with health and vitality, became suspected sources of contagion. The very waters that once symbolized renewal now carried anxiety. Still, for centuries, these bathhouses played an important role in medieval urban life. In the absence of plumbing, they offered access to something rare and precious: hot water. They allowed people to experience physical comfort, communal care, and a moment of reprieve from the harshness of medieval existence. Whether nestled beneath cathedral shadows or hidden in back alleys, they were places where people shed more than their clothes. They shed burdens, shared laughter, and for a while, felt human. The public bathhouse reminds us that medieval life was not as grim and joyless as we often imagine. Even in a world of mud-caked boots and open sewers, people sought warmth, cleanliness, and connection. The bathhouse was a fragile but meaningful attempt to reclaim dignity in a rough and uncertain world. And though they eventually disappeared from most European cities, their steam still lingers in the stories. A misty window into the simple human desire to be clean, to belong, and to breathe easy even for just one evening. 3. Body odor was normal in medieval towns. In the winding streets of a medieval town, the air was thick not only with the scent of wood, smoke, and livestock, but with something far more personal: the unfiltered, unmistakable odor of the human body. Body odor, which today we work tirelessly to suppress with soaps, perfumes, and deodorants, was a daily and accepted reality in medieval life. To live in a medieval town was to live amid a tapestry of smells, pungent, earthy, sour, and sometimes overwhelming. But in a world without running water, scented body products, or a modern understanding of bacteria and hygiene, such smells were not only expected, they were normal. In the absence of regular bathing, sweat clung to the skin for days, often weeks. People labored in fields, kitchens, smithies, and marketplaces, and their bodies told the tale. The wool and linen garments they wore absorbed every scent, rarely washed but often layered, trapping heat and sweat beneath heavy cloaks and thick tunics. Clothes might be beaten in rivers or rinsed on occasion, but frequent laundering was difficult and costly, especially for the poor. The idea of smelling fresh and clean was not part of the cultural ideal. In fact, people in the Middle Ages had entirely different standards for what constituted cleanliness. For many, cleanliness was about visible dirt and maintaining a certain order to one's appearance, combing the hair, keeping fingernails trimmed, changing undergarments. It was believed that a clean linen shirt could purify the body by drawing out impurities through the fabric. Smells were a different matter entirely. Body odor was considered part of the human condition, particularly for laborers and peasants. It was not shameful, it was life. People often carried herbs or flowers in small pouches or tucked into their sleeves, not to make themselves smell better, but to soften the unpleasantness of those around them. The wealthier classes tried to mask their scent with perfumes and oils, imported luxuries made from rose water, spices, and musk. Nobles might change their outer garments more frequently and sometimes bathe with assistants. Yet even in castles, the air was rarely fragrant. Kitchens produced rich, greasy smells, livestock were often kept nearby, and personal hygiene was only slightly more refined than that of common folk. Visitors to court might carry scented handkerchiefs to hold under their noses in crowded halls, especially during feasts or court gatherings. It's important to understand that medieval towns were not just physically dirty, they were sensorially chaotic. The streets were lined with waste, both animal and human. Butchers worked in the open air, fishmongers displayed their goods in the sun, and chamber pots were emptied into ditches or directly onto the street. Amid all of this, the smell of the human body blended in, unremarkable and unnoticed. One did not single it out any more than the smell of a horse or an open fire. When travelers from cleaner, colder regions visited densely packed southern towns, they sometimes recorded shock at the smells. But even these reactions were rare. Most medieval people did not find themselves offended by the odor of others. After all, they carried the same scent. There were no advertisements for freshness, no cultural pressure to remain odorless, and no scientific understanding of what sweat even was. Body odor was not a flaw. It was not even a topic of conversation. It simply existed, part of the environment like dust or rain. This unspoken acceptance of body odor tells us much about the mindset of the time. Medieval people were not indifferent to hygiene, they simply lived within the limits of their world. Without the ability to prevent or erase odor, they redefined what was tolerable. What might seem repellent to us today was, to them, a small part of a larger struggle, surviving in a world of disease, toil, hunger, and war. It's easy to wrinkle our noses at the thought of it all, but perhaps we should also pause. The medieval world was not preoccupied with perfection. It embraced the rawness of existence, the earth beneath one's feet, the smoke in one's hair, the sweat on one's skin. Life was lived close to the body, and the body in turn bore the smell of life itself. 4. Why medieval people were afraid of clean water in the medieval world. Water was everywhere, rivers meandered past towns, wells stood in village squares, and rainfall splashed against the rooftops of manors and peasant huts alike. Yet for all its presence, water was not always welcomed, especially when it came to the act of bathing. In fact, by the late Middle Ages, many people had come to fear clean water. To modern minds, this seems paradoxical. How could something so essential, so life-giving, become the object of suspicion and dread? The answer lies deep in a mix of religious doctrine, medical theory, and practical experience shaped by centuries of hardship and disease. In earlier times, especially during the era of the Roman Empire, bathing was a normal, even celebrated part of life. Aqueducts carried water into cities, and public baths served as both hygienic and social institutions. But as Rome collapsed and Europe entered the so-called Dark Ages, many of its advanced systems for water management fell into disrepair. Without proper infrastructure, water sources quickly became contaminated. Rivers turned into open sewers. Wells were dug dangerously close to latrines. The same water used to drink and wash could carry invisible threats, bacteria, parasites, and waste. But medieval people didn't understand germs. They didn't know about E. coli, cholera, or typhoid. Instead, they relied on the dominant medical theory of the age, the humoral system. According to this theory, the human body was made up of 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and illness occurred when these were out of balance. Bathing, especially in hot water, was believed to open the pores and leave the body vulnerable. If bad air, known as miasma, entered the open skin, it could disrupt the internal balance and cause disease. The irony is haunting. People avoided clean water for fear it might make them sick, while it was the absence of sanitation that truly endangered them. This fear reached a peak during times of plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing millions, terror and superstition followed closely behind. Doctors and scholars struggled to explain the devastation. Many concluded that frequent bathing was partly to blame. Clean water, they reasoned, opened the body too much, exposing it to the corrupted air that carried the plague. In some cities, ordinances were passed discouraging or outright banning public bathing. People began to associate water not with renewal but with death. Religious attitudes also played a role in this aversion. In Christian Europe, physical indulgence, including bathing for comfort or luxury, was often viewed with suspicion. To cleanse the soul was more important than cleansing the body. Public bathhouses, once places of communal care, gradually became associated with immoral behavior, even prostitution. Some were shut down altogether. Others fell into decay, abandoned as relics of a more pagan past. Private bathing at home was rare and difficult. Heating water required labor, firewood, and time, all of which was scarce for the average peasant. Instead of full body washing, people turned to dry methods. They wiped their skin with cloths, changed undergarments more frequently, and used aromatic herbs to ward off unpleasant smells. Washing hands and face with small basins of water was still practiced, especially among the upper classes, but a full bath became increasingly rare and even dangerous in the era. The suspicion toward water endured for centuries. Even into the early modern era, long after the medieval period ended, it remained common for people to bathe only a few times a year. When Queen Elizabeth I was said to bathe once a month, whether she needed it or not, it wasn't a sign of filth, but a reflection of the times. This fear of clean water reveals the complexities of medieval life. People were not foolish or lazy. They were responding to their world with the tools they had: religious teachings, medical theories, and the hard-earned wisdom of observation. If water from a stream had once made a child sick or taken a village elder's life, why not be wary of it? If the town bathhouse had become a place of disease, was it not safer to stay away? And so, the act of bathing, something we now take for granted as a symbol of health and well-being, became instead a ritual of risk. Water, though essential, was not trusted. It was feared, avoided, and misunderstood. Yet through that fear we catch a glimpse of the human story, always adapting, always surviving, even if imperfectly. The people of the Middle Ages did not have our knowledge, but they had instinct, memory, and belief. And in the end, they chose what seemed safest, even if it meant avoiding the very element that might have saved them. Medieval toilets were a nightmare in the grand castles of kings and the cramped homes of peasants. One thing was universally dreadful: the toilet. To modern minds, accustomed to porcelain, plumbing, and privacy, the idea of relieving oneself in the Middle Ages is almost unthinkable. And yet this was a daily reality that every man, woman, and child had to face. The medieval toilet, in whatever form it appeared, was not just uncomfortable. It was often unsanitary, smelly, exposed, and sometimes even dangerous. Whether you were a noble or a farmhand, answering nature's call in the medieval world was truly a nightmare. In castles and fortified manors, the wealthier class had access to what were called garderobes. These were small chambers built into the stone walls, often overhanging the outer moat or a cesspit. A simple wooden bench with a hole cut in the center allowed the waste to drop directly into the open air below. There was no seat, no flush, and certainly no toilet paper. Sometimes straw, moss, or even old cloths were used for wiping, but just as often, people used their hands and washed afterward, if at all. The smell was inescapable, especially since many garderobes were located right next to bedrooms or hallways, with only a thin wooden door separating the space. During hot summers, the stench could be overwhelming. Even worse, these open chutes were accessible to the outside world. In some sieges, enemies climbed into castles through the waste shafts, making them a vulnerability as well as a hazard. Rats, insects, and disease thrived in the filth below. Some castles attempted to manage the problem with gong farmers, men paid to remove human waste from cesspits. Their job, dangerous and degrading, involved climbing into pits of decay with buckets and shovels. The stench clung to their bodies and clothes, and though they were paid relatively well, they were shunned by society. Many died young from exposure to poisonous fumes. In towns and cities, the situation was often worse. Many urban homes didn't have toilets at all. Instead, people used chamber pots, simple ceramic or wooden bowls kept under the bed or near the fireplace. When full, these pots were emptied into the street or into open ditches known as runnels. It was not uncommon for pedestrians to be struck by falling waste dumped from second-story windows. Some towns passed laws requiring people to call out a warning before tossing the contents, but enforcement was minimal and accidents were frequent. The streets reeked of human waste, mixed with animal dung and refuse from markets. Even rain, which might wash the streets clean, only added to the flooding of sewage into basements and homes. Public latrines did exist in some cities, particularly near markets or along rivers, but they were poorly maintained, rarely cleaned, and often shared by dozens of people. There was no separation of gender, no privacy, and no maintenance. Disease spread easily, and the experience of using such facilities was deeply unpleasant. In rural areas, people relieved themselves in the woods, behind barns, or in makeshift holes dug in the ground. The simplicity of the countryside offered a kind of grim freedom, but not much more comfort. The lack of proper sanitation had consequences. Water supplies became contaminated, and diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid spread quickly. Life expectancy was low, and infant mortality was tragically high. Yet people did what they could with what they had. Herbs were hung near garderobes to mask the smell. Some castles had double-shafted toilets to allow better airflow. Peasants learned to avoid certain water sources. But these were imperfect solutions in a world where waste was everywhere, and the technology to safely manage it simply didn't exist. The medieval toilet stands today as one of the clearest symbols of the hardships of the time. It wasn't just about discomfort, it was about the constant battle against the filth of daily life. A reminder that even the most basic human needs could be fraught with danger, shame, and suffering. In a time when even kings sat above motes of waste and the poor shared chamber pots with entire households, privacy was a dream and dignity was hard to come by. We often romanticize the Middle Ages with images of knights' castles and courtly love. But the truth lies in the shadows of those stone walls, in the reeking garderobes, in the bucket-wielding gong farmers, in the filthy alleys of the towns. To understand medieval life is to remember that for all its culture and courage, it was also a time of raw survival, where even going to the bathroom was a battle no one could escape. 6. When waste ran through the streets in medieval towns, the streets were more than just pathways for travel. They were open sewers, marketplaces, trash dumps, and animal pens all at once. Unlike the neatly paved and drained roads of modern cities, medieval streets were often little more than uneven dirt tracks lined with timber-framed houses and bustling shops. But what made these streets truly unforgettable and almost unbearable was the constant presence of human and animal waste. It wasn't hidden underground or whisked away by sanitation systems. It ran, quite literally, through the streets. Without indoor plumbing or organized waste disposal, people relied on chamber pots to collect human waste, which were usually emptied directly onto the street. In wealthier towns, residents might have used garderobes that dropped refuse into the moat or a cesspit, but for most urban dwellers, the simplest and quickest method was to dump it out the window. Etiquette, where it existed, demanded that people shout a warning, something like gardez-l'eau, from the French gardez-l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. But many didn't bother, and the unfortunate passerby often bore the brunt of careless disposal. Streets became slick with filth, especially in densely populated quarters, creating a repugnant mix of mud, excrement, rotting food, and dead animals. The infrastructure of the time offered no real solution. Open drains called runnels were cut into the center or sides of the street to help waste flow away, but they were shallow and often clogged. Rain was both a blessing and a curse. It helped carry the refuse along, but also turned narrow alleys into putrid streams, sometimes flooding homes with contaminated water. During dry spells, the waste would harden into a crust underfoot, releasing a stifling stench under the summer sun. The heat intensified the odors, and insects swarmed everywhere, laying eggs in every dark and fetid corner. Animal waste compounded the issue. Towns were filled with livestock, chickens, pigs, goats, and horses, all of which added their share to the street. Pigs, in particular, were notorious scavengers. In some towns, they roamed freely, eating garbage, human waste, and even corpses in times of famine. Horses left droppings wherever they went, and carts often dragged the filth along, spreading it even farther. This created an ecosystem of decay, one where rats, fleas, and disease thrived. The smell of a medieval street was just unpleasant. It was overwhelming, inescapable, and omnipresent. People tried to cope in whatever ways they could. Homes closest to the main thoroughfares were often shuttered tight to keep the stench out. Herbs and flowers were hung near doorways or carried in pouches to press against the nose in crowded markets. Wealthier citizens sometimes walked with scented cloths or wore pomanders, decorative balls filled with aromatic herbs to fight the nausea. But for most, the smell was something you simply lived with. It was as much a part of city life as the town crier or the blacksmith's hammer. There were efforts from time to time to clean up the streets. Town councils issued edicts banning the dumping of waste outside homes or mandating the construction of cesspits. Fines were imposed, and street cleaners known in some regions as rakers were hired to clear the muck. But enforcement was weak, and the resources limited. The volume of waste was simply too great, and the culture of the time too accustomed to filth as a way of life. Sanitation wasn't seen as a public health issue. Germ theory hadn't been discovered, and illness was blamed on bad air or divine punishment, not bacteria. Looking back, it's hard to imagine the daily reality of medieval streets without a sense of horror. Children played among the filth, barefoot vendors sold food next to ditches of decay, and neighbors emptied their waste inches from where others slept. The streets were alive, but not in a good way. They teemed with the evidence of survival in its most raw and unfiltered form. Waste didn't disappear. It lingered, piled up, soaked in, and ran in rivers through the heart of the town. And yet, for all its repulsiveness, this daily exposure shaped the lives and sensibilities of medieval people. They built their resilience not only against hunger and war, but also against the unrelenting presence of their own environment. In those reeking streets, life pulsed on in laughter and labor, in festivals and funerals, even as the ground beneath their feet bore the weight of a world that hadn't yet learned how to flush away its darkness. 7. Doing laundry in the Middle Ages was filthy work. Doing laundry in the Middle Ages was not the light, perfumed domestic ritual we might imagine today. It was a task of backbreaking effort, a deeply physical and often unpleasant job that involved long hours, harsh substances, and exposure to filth, cold, and even danger. Unlike modern washing machines and scented detergents, medieval laundering was performed by hand in rivers, public washhouses, or rudimentary tubs, and the process was as grueling as it was essential. For most people, laundering clothes wasn't a daily or even weekly routine. Clothes were worn again and again, often until they were visibly soiled or began to smell unbearable. Underclothes, if one could afford them, were washed more often, but outer garments were frequently brushed off rather than cleaned thoroughly. This wasn't laziness or neglect, it was practical. Fabrics were precious, hand-sewn and costly, and the act of scrubbing them, especially with the tools and chemises available, could wear them out far faster than modern laundering methods. The labor often fell to women, particularly washerwomen, many of whom did laundry for wealthier families in exchange for modest pay. These women would gather clothing, linens and textiles, haul them to the nearest water source, and begin the exhausting routine of soaking, beating, scrubbing, rinsing and wringing. The soap they used wasn't the gentle, fragrant bar we imagine today, but a rough mixture made from animal fat and lye, sometimes replaced or supplemented with urine, which was prized for its ammonia content and its ability to lift stains and whiten fabrics. Laundry was a public, physical spectacle. In towns and villages, washerwomen gathered in groups near rivers, where they would kneel or bend over stone slabs or wooden boards, slapping clothes against rocks or pounding them with paddles to drive out dirt. The cold water numbed their hands, and long hours exposed them to wind and rain. In winter months, the work was brutal. In summer, it was no less punishing, as the smell of wet fabric, soap, and waste intensified under the sun. Insects buzzed around soaked clothes. Frogs, rats, and even snakes were not uncommon companions at the river's edge. For the wealthiest, laundry might be done in dedicated washhouses with boiling vats and hired servants. But even in noble households, the task was hard and messy. Boiling water was used to sterilize fabrics and loosen grime, but it could also shrink or damage clothing if not handled with care. Large cauldrons were stirred with heavy sticks, and the steam could scald or suffocate. After boiling and rinsing, clothes were hung out to dry not on neat lines in sunny courtyards, but often draped over hedges, fences or bushes, vulnerable to rain, mud, or passing animals. The act of laundering carried social weight. Washerwomen were often marginalized figures, working class, uneducated, exposed to the public eye and sometimes the subject of suspicion. Their proximity to soiled linens and bodily stains meant they were viewed as unclean, despite being the very people responsible for cleansing others' garments. And yet their labor was indispensable. They were trusted with intimate items, and their skill in removing filth without destroying delicate cloth was respected, even if their social status was not. Laundry also intersected with larger concerns of morality and health. Clean linens were associated with piety, order, and civility, while stained clothing could mark someone as sinful or slovenly. But ironically, the act of laundering itself, especially the use of urine or public exposure, was sometimes frowned upon or regulated by authorities. In cities, laws were passed to control where and how laundry could be done, particularly if waste products from the washing process were contaminants, were contaminating drinking water supplies or spreading disease. Looking back, doing laundry in the Middle Ages was not just a chore, but a test of endurance and perseverance. It was one of many invisible labors that supported daily life, often carried out by those with the fewest resources and the least recognition. Their toil left no historical monuments, but their hands touched every corner of medieval society, from the poorest peasant's tunic to the nobleman's embroidered linens. And in those riverbanks and washhouses, soaked in cold water and human effort, we glimpse a different kind of history, one not of kings and knights, but of those who quietly kept the world clean enough to carry on. 8. Hair, lice, and the medieval head itch. In the Middle Ages, the human scalp was a battleground where strands of unwashed hair tangled with dirt, oils, and relentless parasites. Head lice, nits, and other crawling creatures were not occasional nuisances but constant companions, embedded in the daily life of people from all walks of society. Whether peasant or noble, no one was immune to the irritating itch and silent humiliation of lice. Hair care, like most hygiene practices during this time, was primitive, and the combination of infrequent washing, overcrowded living conditions, and lack of personal cleanliness turned the scalp into a perfect habitat for infestation. Medieval people often wore hoods, veils, caps, or coifs which trapped heat and sweat and made their scalps even more inviting for parasites. Bathing and hair washing were infrequent at best, and sometimes actively avoided due to fears that water could spread disease or make the body more vulnerable to illness by opening the pores. As a result, heads were rarely cleansed thoroughly. Hair became sticky with sweat and oils and served as a convenient shelter for lice and fleas, who thrived in the dense growth of human locks. The scratching was constant, the embarrassment routine, and yet there was little people could do but live with it. Combs existed and were widely used not as styling tools but as delousing instruments. Fine tooth combs made from wood, bone, or ivory were painstakingly dragged through the hair to catch nits and lice. This task, although unpleasant, could become a social activity. Women, in particular, would often sit together and help one another clean their heads. In monasteries and nunneries, communal grooming was part of the daily routine. It wasn't just about hygiene, it was a small way to show care and solidarity in a world where survival often depended on close cooperation. Among the lower classes, cutting hair short or even shaving the head became a practical way to manage lice outbreaks, especially during the summer months or in times of plague. In wealthier households, elaborate hair coverings and veils were worn not only as fashion statements, but also as attempts to conceal unwashed, infested hair from both sight and smell. Ointments and herbal washes made from rosemary, lavender, or vinegar were sometimes used to ease itching, though they were more about temporary relief than permanent solutions. Even within religious communities, lice were so common they were sometimes accepted as a natural part of human existence. Monks and nuns referred to them as the pearls of poverty or the jewels of the poor, a grim attempt to romanticize what was, in truth, a miserable condition. Pilgrims and travelers were especially susceptible, carrying lice from one village or city to another, helping infestations spread rapidly. And in crowded homes where entire families might sleep in one bed, lice moved easily from head to head under the cover of night. The cultural response to lice was telling. Though people may have joked about them or accepted them as fate, the presence of lice marked a deeper truth. Medieval life was inseparable from the discomforts of the body. Even the most basic hygiene practices were a luxury, and solutions were temporary at best. The constant itch, the red marks on the scalp, the feeling of something crawling through your hair while you tried to sleep, these were not rare symptoms but part of the lived experience of an age. Today we associate lice with neglect or poor hygiene, but in the medieval period it was simply a reality, as common as mud on your boots or smoke in your lungs. People adapted, endured, and made what little efforts they could to manage the relentless irritation. The medieval itch was not just physical, it was symbolic of a deeper struggle against filth, against nature, and against the limits of what people could control in a world where knowledge, resources, and solutions were always out of reach. Through the lens of head lice, we glimpsed the resilience of everyday people who carried on scratching while building a world in spite of the crawling life upon them. Perfume, the medieval replacement for bathing in an age when water was feared, baths were rare, and the very idea of daily hygiene as we know it was practically non-existent. Perfume rose to prominence instant. In the Middle Ages, especially among the upper classes, the scent of sweet oils and exotic fragrances often stood in for what we today would consider basic cleanliness. Without the convenience of soap, showers, or plumbing, medieval people turned to perfume to mask the natural odors of unwashed bodies. The result was a culture in which scent became a social signifier, a coping mechanism, and even a form of spiritual protection. Perfumes in the medieval world were not mass-produced in shiny bottles, but carefully prepared in apothecaries or monastery kitchens, made from steeped herbs, crushed flowers, distilled resins, and imported spices. Rosewater, lavender, frankincense, musk, myrrh, and cinnamon were common ingredients, mixed with alcohol or oils and stored in small vials. These perfumes were not just worn on the skin, they were sprinkled on clothes, waved through rooms on scented cloths, or burned in censers to fill the air with fragrance. The idea was not to remove filth, but to obscure it, to cover the smell of sweat and decay with something more pleasant, more refined. Among nobles, perfume became part of the daily ritual. In courts, ladies might dab perfume behind their ears or on handkerchiefs, not just for allure but for endurance, to make it through long feasts or crowded audiences without gagging from the stink of humanity pressed together in poorly ventilated halls. Men, too, would scent their beards or gloves. Even letters were sometimes perfumed as a gesture of refinement or affection. For those who could afford it, scent became a kind of armor against the constant assault of odors in medieval life. But perfume also had a deeper meaning. In a world plagued by disease and mystery, smells were believed to carry spiritual and medical significance. Bad odors, or miasmas, were thought to be dangerous, capable of spreading illness or corrupting the soul. Good smells, on the other hand, were believed to purify the air and the spirit. To wear perfume was not merely to smell good, it was to protect oneself. During plagues, people clutched nosegays of aromatic herbs or carried pomanders filled with perfumed wax, hoping to ward off the invisible menace in the air. Monks might burn incense to cleanse not just the chapel, but the body and soul alike. Of course, the use of perfume was also deeply tied to class. The poor had little access to fragrant substances and relied on natural remedies or rougher materials smoked from wood fires, the scent of vinegar or pungent herbs. While the rich were masking their scent with imported attars, the working classes lived among livestock, refuse, and filth with few defences. The gap between perfumed nobility and the stink of peasant life was not just physical but symbolic of the broader divisions of medieval society. Yet even with all this perfume, the truth remained that nothing truly covered the underlying reality. The odours of sweat, rot, mildew, and decay still clung to skin and fabric alike. Perfume was a mask, not a cure. It floated on top of the stench, offering momentary relief but no true solution. And this, in its way, reflects the essence of medieval hygiene, a patchwork of rituals and beliefs trying desperately to manage what could not yet be fully understood or controlled. Through perfume, we see the medieval world not only in its sensory richness, but in its desperation, its need to impose beauty, order, and comfort on a world of discomfort, disease, and uncertainty. Scent was not merely about attraction, it was about survival, about dignity, about asserting some measure of control over a body and a world that often refused to be clean. And so, in the dim candlelight of a medieval chamber, where water was scarce and baths were feared, the air would shimmer not with soap, but with the heavy sweetness of rose and spice a breath of grace in a world that rarely offered any. In the medieval world, where razors were crude, mirrors were rare, and barbers doubled as surgeons, the act of shaving was more than a grooming ritual, it was an exercise in courage. For the average man of the Middle Ages, removing facial hair was a task fraught with danger, discomfort, with disdain, and the ever-looming risk of disfigurement or infection. Shaving mishaps were not just occasional slip-ups, they were common hazards of daily life. Unlike the finely honed steel blades of today, medieval razors were often made of iron or bronze and could become dull quickly. They tugged at the hair, scraped the skin, and required a steady hand, which was rarely guaranteed. For those who shaved themselves at home, any lapse in attention could lead to deep nicks, angry welts, or even open wounds, particularly risky in an era before antiseptics. And yet, for religious, cultural, or professional reasons, men still sought to tame their beards or remove them entirely, believing a clean face reflected discipline, piety, or status. For many, the solution was to visit the local barber. But these barbers were not merely hair cutters, they were also tooth pullers, bloodletters, and wound cleaners. Their shops smelled of herbs and iron, and while their tools were sharp, their knowledge of hygiene was limited. A slip of the hand could cause a gash, a reused razor could spread infection. The lack of sterilization made even the smallest cut a potential entryway for disease. And in a world ravaged by plagues and festering illnesses, even a shaving wound could become life-threatening. Then there were the accidental shaves administered during warfare or punishment. Soldiers might lose parts of their beards to fire, blades, or rough living. Criminals and accused witches could be forcibly shaved to pay as a form of public humiliation. The removal of hair was not always voluntary, and it could strip a person not only of their appearance but of their dignity. In monasteries, too, the The tonsure, a partially shaved head, was a symbol of religious devotion, but it required regular maintenance and precise trimming. Mistakes in these rituals weren't just embarrassing, they could be seen as disrespectful to the divine order. Even the idea of a mirror was a luxury. Polished metal or still water served as primitive reflections, but neither offered the clarity we take for granted. Shaving in such conditions often meant relying on touch and memory, resulting in asymmetrical beards, missed patches, or unintended bald spots. For young boys coming of age or men trying to impress in courtship or commerce, a poorly executed shave could damage one's confidence and social standing. Cultural expectations also played a role. While some regions prized beards as a sign of masculinity, others, especially during certain religious movements, saw shaving as a sign of humility or orderliness. But regardless of the ideal, achieving it was rarely easy. The pain, the effort, and the potential for injury meant that many men lived with scars not just from battle, but from their daily grooming routines. And yet, these mishaps tell us something deeper about medieval life. They remind us how even the most mundane acts, shaving, washing, dressing, were layered with risk, symbolism, and struggle. In a world without antibiotics or modern comfort, looking presentable was not a right but a challenge. Every smooth cheek was hard-earned, every trimmed beard a product of tension between style and survival. So the next time we glide a modern razor across our face with hot water and soothing lotion, it's worth remembering those who came before, those who braved cold steel and unsteady hands, not in a sa, but in the dim corners of a drafty home or a smoky barbershop. Their stories, and their nicks and cuts, remind us of the fragility of the human effort to tame both appearance and fate. 10. The bathhouse attendant, dirtiest job in history. In the bustling, dimly lit bathhouses of the Middle Ages, steam clung to wooden walls, water slushed onto straw-covered floors, and laughter, gossip, and groans filled the air. These bathhouses, places of both hygiene and hedonism, were essential to medieval urban life. But behind the warmth of the baths and the social rituals they hosted, there was someone working endlessly in the background, someone largely invisible and rarely appreciated: the bathhouse attendant. Far from a relaxing job, this role was one of the most grueling, unpleasant, and dangerous occupations in medieval society. The bathhouse attendant's day began early, often before dawn. They were responsible for hauling in heavy buckets of water, cold from wells or rivers and hot from lavines, heated by roaring fires. The physical labor was backbreaking, relentless, and often performed in suffocating heat. Once the baths were filled, the attendant had to maintain the correct temperature, constantly stoking fires and adjusting the flow of water. There was no modern plumbing, no thermostats, only instinct, practice, and burnt fingertips. Beyond managing the water, the attendant was expected to clean the baths between patrons. But cleaning in the medieval sense rarely meant sterilizing or truly disinfecting. Most bathhouses reused the same water for multiple guests, and the attendant might be tasked with skimming off visible filth, wiping down benches, or disposing of used herbs and oils. Bodily fluids, sweat, skin flakes, lice, and worse floated in the water or clung to the wooden tubs. The attendant had to plunge their hands and sometimes their entire bodies into these murky depths, risking infections, rashes, or worse. The bathhouse was not simply a place for bathing. In many cities, it was also a hub of vice, a space where business deals, romantic encounters, and illicit transactions took place. Attendants had to witness everything from drunken arguments to whispered trysts without reacting. They were expected to remain discreet, present yet invisible, serving refreshments, handing out towels, or cleaning up after scenes they were never meant to discuss. In some regions, bathhouses had a reputation for doubling as brothels, and the attendant often found themselves tangled in moral grey zones, navigating both physical filth and social scandal. Their proximity to so many strangers, many of whom were ill or infested with lice and disease, meant that bathhouse attendants were exposed to constant health risks: skin infections, respiratory ailments from steam inhalation, and the ever-present threat of plague lingered in the moist, warm environment. There were no protective gloves, no medical oversight, and certainly no workers' compensation. When a customer died in the bath, a not uncommon occurrence, it was the attendant who cleaned up the body, drained the tub, and readied the room for the next visitor, as though nothing had happened. Despite the hardship, the job offered little in the way of status. Attendants were often from the lower classes, orphans, widows, or those desperate for work. The wealth and pleasure that flowed through the bathhouse rarely touched them. Patrons might tip them with coins or scraps of food, but more often, they were treated as part of the scenery, expected to work tirelessly without recognition. They were servants in every sense of the word, soaked in other people's luxury, but denied its comfort. And yet, there was a strange resilience to the role. The bathhouse attendant became a silent witness to the rhythms of medieval life, to the vanities of the wealthy, the struggles of the poor, the rituals of hygiene, and the absurdities of human behavior. They knew more about their townspeople than any priest or merchant. They saw people stripped of clothes, titles, and pretense. In the bath, everyone was exposed, but only the attendant remained anonymous. In reflecting on this job, one cannot help but feel a deep empathy for those who endured its burdens. It was, without exaggeration, one of the dirtiest jobs in history. But it was also a necessary one, thankless, exhausting, and yet vital to the function of medieval society. Behind every hot bath and moment of relaxation stood someone sweating in the shadows, managing the heat, the bodies, and the mess. Their story, too often untold, is a reminder of how civilizations are held up not only by kings and knights but by the hands of the humble, who labored where few dared to look. 11. Bathing once a year was considered enough in the modern world, where daily showers are often seen as essential to basic hygiene. The idea of bathing just once a year seems unthinkable. But in medieval Europe, that was not only acceptable, it was, in some cases, considered more than enough. For many people of the time, especially in the later Middle Ages, bathing was a rare and often discouraged activity. This wasn't entirely due to laziness or lack of water, but rather a mixture of cultural beliefs, fear, religion, climate, and lack of infrastructure that reshaped how cleanliness was perceived. For early medieval Europeans, bathing was not initially seen as dangerous. In fact, during the early Middle Ages, public bathhouses still thrived in many cities, a legacy left over from the Roman Empire. However, as centuries passed and attitudes changed, especially during and after the Black Death in the 14th century, the concept of regular bathing began to be viewed with increasing suspicion. One reason was the widespread belief that bathing opened the pores and made the body more vulnerable to disease. Since medical knowledge was limited and often rooted in superstition and religious teachings, many believed that hot water, steam, and exposed skin would allow bad humors or miasmas foul, invisible airs carrying illness to seep into the body. In times of plague, many were advised to avoid water entirely. Religious doctrine also played a role. While early Christianity didn't explicitly condemn bathing, the growing emphasis on humility, modesty, and avoidance of vanity led to increasing discomfort with public nudity and with the idea of excessive concern for physical appearance. Bathing, especially when done communally, was sometimes associated with moral corruption or temptation. Cleanliness of the soul, rather than the body, became the ideal. In monasteries, bathing was restricted, sometimes to once a year, or only for the sick, and this ascetic model trickled into broader society as a virtue. Moreover, for much of the rural population, especially peasants, access to clean water, soap, and privacy was limited or non-existent. Rivers and streams were often the only sources of water, but they were frequently polluted by waste, animal runoff, and industrial byproducts like dye or tanning. In winter, washing in icy water was not only unpleasant but potentially deadly. Heating water in large quantities was time-consuming and expensive, especially for large families or entire communities. And so, gradually people simply adapted to being dirty. Clothes were rarely changed, let alone washed, and heavy layers helped mask both stains and odors. Hair was combed but not often cleaned. Lice and fleas were common companions. Body odor, to modern noses unbearable, became normalized. The rare occasion of a bath might coincide with religious holidays, weddings, or major life events, moments where a symbolic cleansing matched a spiritual one. A yearly bath, if that was enough. Despite the infrequency of bathing, people still found ways to feel clean by medieval standards. They might wash their hands and faces with cold water in the mornings, rub themselves with cloths, use herbs to mask odors, or change the outermost layers of clothing when they could afford it. The wealthy might perfume themselves or their linens, but full immersion in water remained rare and was often considered a luxury or a risk. This view toward bathing did not go uncontested. In other parts of the world, such as the Islamic world or East Asia, regular bathing was an essential part of both religious practice and cultural expectation. But in medieval Europe, especially during and after the Black Death, the once-a-year bath was accepted as a pragmatic norm. Looking back, it's easy to view this as unhygienic or even repulsive. But it also reveals how culture, fear, and environment shape behavior. When survival itself was uncertain, and disease was poorly understood, avoiding a bath might have felt like an act of caution, even wisdom. While we may be grateful for the luxury of daily hygiene today, the medieval belief that one annual bath was enough is a reminder that cleanliness is never just about water, it's about perception, circumstance, and the shifting standards of what it means to be clean. 12. The strange obsession with steam rooms in the damp, smoky world of the Middle Ages, where bathing in water was increasingly discouraged or feared, an unusual yet widespread fascination with steam rooms emerged. Known in various places as sweat houses or stews, These rudimentary saunas became a curious middle ground between hygiene, healing, and hedonism. While full-body immersion in hot water was seen by many as dangerous or even sinful, the enveloping warmth of steam was often welcomed, and in some circles, even obsessively embraced. The medieval steam room had its roots in ancient traditions. The Roman baths, with their caldariums and tepidariums, had introduced the concept of sweating as a way to purify the body. Long after the fall of Rome, remnants of this practice persisted in various forms across Europe. In Nordic and Slavic regions, steam baths remained a regular part of life, used for cleansing, socializing, and spiritual rituals. But even in the heart of Western Europe, where bathing was viewed with suspicion, the allure of steam endured. Medieval steam rooms were usually small, enclosed wooden or stone structures, heated by pouring water over hot stones or through furnaces beneath the floors. The rising steam filled the space, enveloping the occupants in suffocating warmth. Patrons, often completely nude or wrapped in cloth, would sit or lie on benches as they sweat profusely, believing the vapor would cleanse their bodies of toxins, sins, and bad humors. For a people wary of washing with water, this became a ritual that offered both physical relief and psychological reassurance. Some believed steam could draw out disease. Without understanding germ theory, medieval physicians operated on the concept of balancing bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Excess of one or another could supposedly lead to illness. Steam, by making one sweat, was thought to purge these imbalances. The steam house thus became both a medical treatment and a preventive measure, especially during times of plague or seasonal sickness. People would flock to these rooms with hope, desperation, or habit, seeking health in the mist. But the steam room's role wasn't only medical. These places were also intensely social and sometimes scandalous. In many cities, they became places for gossip, informal business deals, and intimate encounters. The boundary between wellness and pleasure was often blurred. Attendants served drinks or food. Some bathhouses even offered music or entertainment. It didn't take long for some establishments to develop reputations less for healing than for indulgence. As a result, religious and civic leaders began to condemn certain steam houses as dens of sin. By the late Middle Ages, many towns placed restrictions on these establishments, or shut them down entirely, not because of hygiene, but due to moral panic. Even as the reputation of steam rooms shifted, the obsession remained. They had become a cultural fixture deeply tied to medieval ideas of purification without water. Ironically, though they were more acceptable than bathing, they often weren't much cleaner. Many steam rooms were poorly ventilated and rarely scrubbed, filled with sweat, grime, and the lingering presence of countless bodies. Illness could easily spread within them, especially as users often visited while already sick. But for many, the perceived benefits outweighed the risks. In a world dominated by disease, superstition, and a lack of effective cures, the steam room was both a ritual and a refuge. Looking back, the medieval fixation on steam rooms offers a curious insight into how people sought control over their health and bodies. Without access to modern hygiene or medicine, they turned to tradition, belief, and communal experience. In that thick fog of heat and sweat, people found a way to feel clean, healed, and momentarily unburdened. Their obsession may seem strange today, but in context, it was a creative and very human response to a world that was anything but sanitary. 13. When kings didn't know how to use soap in the grand halls of medieval castles, where gold leaf shimmered on the walls and velvet draped over thrones, there was often one thing missing: the basic knowledge of how to use soap. Kings, queens, and nobles alike wore jeweled rings and fur-lined robes, but many had only the faintest understanding of personal hygiene. The idea that royalty could rule vast territories, raise armies, negotiate treaties, yet remain ignorant of how to wash themselves properly may seem absurd today. But in the Middle Ages, cleanliness was neither widely practiced nor well understood, even at the highest levels of society. Soap was not entirely unknown in medieval Europe. In fact, it had been used in ancient Rome and continued to be made by artisans throughout the continent. The process involved boiling animal fats with lyre ashes, creating a hard, caustic bar that could cut through grease and dirt. However, soap in the Middle Ages was often seen as a tool for laundering clothes, not for cleaning the body. To many, the very act of scrubbing one's skin with such a substance seemed foreign, even dangerous. For royalty, who often relied on superstition and outdated medical theories, the idea of regular bathing, let alone using soap, was viewed with suspicion. It was widely believed that hot water could open the pores and allow disease to enter the body. Doctors warned that washing too frequently could weaken the constitution or disrupt the balance of humors. As a result, many kings bathed only a few times a year, and when they did, it was often a perfumed soak surrounded by servants and rituals, not an act of real cleansure. Historical records provide amusing and sometimes shocking examples. King Louis XIV of France, who ruled with opulence from the Palace of Versailles, is said to have taken only a handful of baths in his lifetime. When illness or courtly etiquette required some form of washing, it was more symbolic than effective. Warm rose water might be dabbed on the face or hands. Scented oils masked the odor. Soap, if used at all, was gently applied by attendants, not by the monarch himself, and often quickly rinsed off for fear of disrupting the body's natural balance. What's even more curious is that soap-making guilds did exist, and good quality soap was available particularly in regions like Castile, Marseilles, and Aleppo. But this soap was often exported or reserved for laundering linens, not for the royal body. Among the peasantry and working classes, more practical uses of soap occasionally surfaced, especially among those who labored and needed to clean dirt from their hands and clothes. But among the elites who prided themselves on being above manual labor, the idea of scrubbing was considered undignified. The absence of soap in royal routines didn't just result in body odor, it often had health consequences. Skin diseases, lice infestations, and infections were common at court. Elaborate wigs and layers of clothing helped conceal physical issues, but they didn't prevent them. Physicians might diagnose rashes or boils as signs of divine punishment or astrological imbalance, rarely considering the simple cause, a lack of basic hygiene. From a modern perspective, the idea of a powerful king unable or unwilling to wash himself properly seems ludicrous. But in the medieval worldview, health, cleanliness, and status was shaped by superstition, tradition, and class. The dirtier you were, the more you seemed removed from labor and thus closer to nobility. Soap was a tool of necessity, not refinement. And yet, within this backwardness lies a lesson. The inability to grasp the basics of cleanliness wasn't due to a lack of intelligence, but a lack of knowledge and a society that placed ritual and hierarchy above science and self-care. In a world where kings did not know how to use soap, we're reminded that even the most powerful can fall victim to ignorance. Cleanliness, it turns out, is not just next to godliness, it's also deeply political, profoundly cultural, and often far more revolutionary than a crown. 14. Lice combs. A knight's everyday weapon. In the romanticized vision of medieval knights, we often picture shining armor, gallant sword fights, and noble quests across vast kingdoms. Yet beneath the polished plate and chivalrous ideals lay a much humbler, far richer truth. Among the tools that accompanied a knight in his daily life alongside the sword, shield, and dagger was another, far less glamorous item, the lice comb. Though not enshrined in legend or epic poetry, this small wooden or ivory instrument played a crucial role in the daily battle against one of the most persistent foes of the Middle Ages, lice. Lice were an inescapable reality in medieval society, infesting people across all classes and professions, from lowly peasants to the highest of nobles. Knights, despite their wealth and status, were no exception. The heavy layers of wool, linen, and fur they wore created perfect environments for lice to thrive, especially under helmets and coifs worn for battle. Bathing was rare, head washing even rarer, and shampoo non-existent. It wasn't long before the scalp became a breeding ground for relentless itching, discomfort, and even sores caused by constant scratching. To manage the problem, knights and indeed most people relied heavily on lice combs. These fine-toothed tools, often carved with intricate designs, were treasured daily implements, used not only for personal grooming but as necessary defenses against the microscopic armies crawling through their hair. Historical artifacts show that lice combs were commonly made from bone or wood, carefully whittled to catch the tiny parasites and their eggs. Combing was usually done slowly, methodically, and often as a shared ritual with servants or companions, much like delousing a fellow soldier in the calm before a campaign. For a knight, using a lice comb became part of the morning routine. After donning the shirt, tightening the belt, and perhaps saying a prayer, he might sit by the fire and draw the comb through his hair, pausing to inspect the captured intruders. It was not only an act of hygiene but one of sanity. In a time when bathing might occur only a few times a year, the simple act of combing provided one of the only means of keeping parasites at bay. The presence of lice was more than a minor inconvenience, it carried real health risks. Open wounds from scratching could become infected, leading to fevers or worse. In densely populated camps or towns, lice helped spread diseases like typhus, which could ravage entire communities. Yet the connection between lice and illness wasn't clearly understood in the medieval world. The comb was seen more as a tool of comfort than of prevention. Interestingly, lice combs were so essential that they were often carried on long journeys, tucked away in saddlebags or traveling chests. Archaeological finds in graves and ruins frequently turn up these humble combs, sometimes inscribed with prayers or protective symbols. They were both mundane and personal items that rarely made it into chronicles or ballads, but were as crucial to daily life as a sword. What's striking is how such a simple object reveals the unglamorous truths of history. The image of a knight sitting by candlelight, carefully combing through his hair for lice, shatters many romantic ideals about the Middle Ages. Yet it also humanizes these figures. Beneath the armor and honor, they itched, scratched, and sighed just like anyone else. In the end, the lice comb stands as a quiet testament to resilience, not the kind forged in battle, but in the slow, persistent struggle for comfort and cleanliness in a world where hygiene was constantly under siege. It was not a weapon of war, but one of endurance. And in the grand tapestry of medieval life, it mattered more than most would ever sing about. 15. How people brushed their teeth in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, dental hygiene was not so much a routine as it was a patchwork of folk practices, superstition, and improvisation. The modern toothbrush had not yet been invented, and toothpaste, as we know it, was centuries away. Yet despite these limitations, people in the medieval world still cared at least to some extent about their teeth. They just had very different ways of maintaining them, and the results, as you might imagine, were mixed at best. Medieval people didn't brush their teeth in the modern sense. Instead, they used a combination of methods to clean their mouths or mask bad breath. One of the most common tools was a simple chew stick, a thin twig from aromatic trees like hazel, birch, or rosemary. These sticks were frayed at one end by chewing, turning them into a kind of natural brush. People would rub these makeshift brushes along their teeth, not necessarily to remove plaque, an invisible concept to them, but to scrape off visible residue or food particles. Another common practice was rinsing the mouth with water or with mixtures made from herbs, vinegar, or even wine. Mint leaves, cloves, and sage were popular choices to chew for a fresher breath. These methods often aimed more at sweetening the breath than maintaining gum health or preventing decay. A few medieval medical texts recommend rubbing teeth and gums with a cloth soaked in salt, ash, or crushed herbs. While some of these concoctions might have had mild antibacterial effects, they were a far cry from effective dental care. Interestingly, some medieval sources did show a surprising understanding of oral health. Texts from the Islamic Golden Age and some early European manuscripts acknowledged that sweet foods could harm the teeth. Wealthy individuals, especially in later medieval periods, sometimes paid physicians or barbers to scrape away plaque or pull problematic teeth, though the latter was done without anesthesia and often with brutal tools like pliers. The average peasant, of course, had little access to these services. Diet played a significant role in oral health, and ironically, poorer people may have had slightly better teeth than the rich, simply because their diets contained fewer sugars and refined foods. They ate coarse bread, vegetables, and drank mostly water or thin ale, which did less damage to teeth than the sugary treats and imported wines favored by nobles. That said, the rough, gritty texture of medieval bread, often made with flour contaminated by millstone grit, also wore down enamel over time. As for toothpaste, some medieval recipes included ingredients like crushed coral, powdered bone, burnt rosemary, or ground oyster shells mixed with honey or vinegar. While these mixtures could leave the mouth feeling cleaner, many of them were highly abrasive and damaging to enamel. It wasn't uncommon for people to slowly erode their own teeth in the process of trying to keep them clean. Tooth decay and gum disease were common, and bad breath was nearly universal. Rotting teeth, abscesses, and infections plagued the elderly and even the young. Without antibiotics or effective surgical procedures, a tooth infection could become life-threatening. Yet despite the risks, many people endured dental pain in silence, only seeking help when the agony became unbearable. Looking back, it's remarkable to consider how people did the best they could with the limited knowledge and tools they had. They improvised, they experimented, and they passed down their methods from generation to generation. Though often ineffective, these early forms of dental care were born from the same human desire we still carry today: to look presentable, to feel clean, and to avoid pain. What this story shows us is that even in a world shrouded in superstition and hardship, hygiene was not entirely forgotten. People may not have understood bacteria or cavities, but they knew enough to value clean breath and a healthy mouth. In their own rudimentary way, they fought back against decay, one chew stick at a time. 16. Straw for toilet paper. Medieval life was rough. Toilet paper, as we know it today, soft, scented, conveniently rolled, did not exist in the Middle Ages. In fact, the very concept of designated material for cleaning oneself after using the toilet was foreign to much of medieval society. Sanitation was a matter of practicality and survival, not comfort. When nature called, people responded with whatever was at hand, and more often than not, that meant straw. Yes, straw. Dried, coarse, scratchy straw. In rural villages where life revolved around farming and animal care, straw was abundant and always nearby. It lined the floors of cottages, cushioned bedding, absorbed spills, and sometimes perhaps most unglamorously served as toilet paper. After using the latrine or relieving oneself in a chamber pot, a handful of straw could be used to wipe, not because it was ideal, but because it was simply available. Of course, straw wasn't the only option. Leaves, moss, wool clumps, and even scraps of cloth were used, depending on one's social status and access to materials. In some wealthier households, old rags were saved for this purpose, washed and reused until they disintegrated. In public latrines or castle garderobes, stones or broken pieces of ceramic, known as pasoi in ancient cultures, might be used as well. It was a matter of resourcefulness, not refinement. In monastic communities where discipline and cleanliness were more structured, hygiene was taken more seriously but still far from modern standards. Latrines were often built over flowing water channels to help carry waste away, but users were still left to their own devices when it came to personal cleaning. For monks or scholars, manuscripts suggest that handfuls of hay or linen scraps were common, though never particularly comfortable. The lack of proper sanitation didn't stop with wiping. Without plumbing or sewage systems, most people simply tossed their waste, human or otherwise, into nearby pits, rivers, or even the street. This compounded the already unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and villages. Combined with poor hygiene habits, the rudimentary wiping materials only worsened public health. It's hard to imagine, in today's world of hyper-clean bathrooms and industrial hygiene, what it must have been like to rely on straw or bark for such a sensitive task. But this was daily life for centuries. Children were raised to think of it as normal, and discomfort was simply a part of existence. There were no scented wipes, no soft-ply options, just whatever the earth could offer or hands could find. The deeper truth this uncomfortable detail reveals is how far removed medieval society was from personal comfort as a concept. Life was survival. Tasks like eating, sleeping, or using the toilet weren't designed for ease. They were about function, simplicity, and endurance. People had more pressing concerns: famine, plague, war, and weather. The idea of fussing over toilet tissue would have seemed laughable, if not downright luxurious. Yet, within this gritty reality lies something humbling. Humanity adapted, persevered, and continued to live and grow despite the daily indignities. The use of straw is just one example of how people throughout history have made do with what they had, even in the most private and vulnerable moments of life. It may make us wince or grimace today, but it also reminds us of our roots, of the long, rough road humanity has walked to reach the comforts we now enjoy. Perhaps that's the lesson buried under the straw. Never take softness for granted. 17. Strange toilet customs of the 14th century. In the 14th century, using the toilet wasn't just a private matter, it was a reflection of the era's beliefs, fears, and peculiar customs surrounding cleanliness and waste. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of modern plumbing or sanitation systems. Instead, they developed their own toilet customs, some of which seem bizarre, shocking, or downright unsanitary to us today. To start with, the very concept of a toilet was fluid in medieval life. In castles and larger homes, the most common form was the garderobe, a small room jutting out from the wall, often above a moat or cesspit. Waste would drop through a hole directly into the water or ground below. These spaces were cold, drafty, and often reeked terribly. Still, for nobles, this was considered high class. The word garderobe even hints at its dual purpose. Nobles often hung their clothes there, believing that the pungent ammonia fumes from the waste would kill lice and other parasites. For the general population, toilet customs were much simpler and far less dignified. Most people used chamber pots inside their homes, small bowls or buckets, often stored under the bed. Once full, the pot's contents would be thrown into the street, often with a warning shout like "Gardez-le," a corruption of the French "Gare de l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. Streets in medieval towns lacked drainage or proper sewers, so human waste mingled with rainwater, animal dung, and food scraps in ankle-deep filth that ran through the roads. It wasn't unusual for people to get sick or worse from the bacteria-laden sludge. Some public spaces had shared latrines, especially in monasteries or large cities. These were long benches with holes, sometimes positioned over a stream to carry waste away. However, privacy was limited, and these places were often dirty and infested with insects. In some cultures, communal toileting was less taboo than it is now. People would converse or even conduct business while relieving themselves. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't exist. People used whatever they could find: straw, moss, rags, or even their hands. The idea of washing after using the toilet was foreign to most. Instead, filth was accepted as part of life. In fact, many people believed that washing too often could weaken the body and open it up to disease. This belief, compounded with lack of knowledge about germs, created a culture where people endured stench and discomfort as a daily reality. One particularly strange custom involved the position for relieving oneself. Without modern toilet seats, many people squatted over holes in the ground or used close stools, portable boxes with a seat and a pot underneath. In rural areas, the woods or fields were commonly used, especially for those working the land. Children were often trained from an early age to use chamber pots, and discipline was harsh for accidents, though understandably, accidents were frequent. The medieval attitude toward human waste was shaped by necessity, not nicety. People didn't have the option of flushing and forgetting. Instead, waste had to be carried, dumped, or managed by hand. In larger cities, waste collectors were sometimes hired to clean cesspits, a job so foul it was considered one of the lowest in society. Looking back, the strange toilet customs of the 14th century are more than just curiosities. They are windows into a world defined by limitations, ingenuity, and a very different relationship with the body. Where we now expect privacy, cleanliness, and convenience, medieval people navigated bodily needs with a mix of ritual, resignation, and practicality. It's tempting to laugh or cringe at their customs, but we shouldn't forget that these people lived according to the best knowledge and resources they had. In a world without germ theory, without plumbing, and without public health education, what we see as strange was simply survival. The next time we flush a toilet without a second thought, it's worth remembering that not long ago, the act of relieving oneself was an ordeal filled with noise, smell, cold air, and risk. And somehow people still managed to live, love, build cities, and write history, all while navigating the most basic and humbling part of human life. 18. The royal palace smelled not so royal. The grandeur of medieval royal palaces often conjures images of majestic halls, glittering feasts, and luxurious lifestyles. Yet behind the velvet drapes and stone towers lay a far less glamorous reality. The royal palace, despite its splendor, smelled absolutely awful. Contrary to modern expectations, these homes of kings and queens were plagued by the same fundamental issues as any other medieval building: lack of sanitation, limited hygiene, and a general misunderstanding of cleanliness. And with more servants, more visitors, more food, and more waste, royal palaces often reeked worse than the homes of peasants. The architecture of medieval palaces was impressive, but hardly sanitary. Castles and palaces were constructed with thick stone walls, narrow windows, and minimal ventilation. As hundreds of people moved, lived, and worked inside the same space without modern plumbing, air filtration, or regular cleaning routines, the air would quickly turn foul. The smell of unwashed bodies, cooked meat, spilled ale, animal stables, smoke from open fires, and rotting waste all mingled to create a nauseating atmosphere that no amount of rose water could fully cover. One of the biggest contributors to the stench was the lack of proper bathrooms. Royals used garderobes just like other nobles, which were essentially holes in the floor that led to a chute or pit. These would often dump directly into the castle moat or surrounding ditches. Over time, these areas would overflow or clog, creating an unbearable odor. And because moats were also seen as protective features, they were rarely cleaned. Some castles even had multiple garderobes stacked vertically, meaning if the one below got blocked, the problem escalated, both literally and olfactorily. In addition to human waste, royal kitchens produced an enormous amount of food daily. While the feasts themselves were impressive, the behind-the-scenes mess was significant. Large quantities of meat, fish, and produce were prepared, often with little attention to preservation or hygiene. Leftovers were tossed into buckets or out of windows. Drains were rudimentary at best. Rats, flies, and spoiled food were common sights in palace kitchens and storage rooms. Even the royals themselves were not paragons of personal hygiene. Many monarchs believed that bathing too often was harmful to health, a widely held belief in the Middle Ages. Instead, they relied on perfumes, herbs, and powders to mask body odor. Queen Isabella of Spain reportedly bathed only twice in her life, once when she was born and once when she was married. Royal garments, layered and elaborate, were rarely washed and often reused for years. Courtiers and nobles followed similar routines, which meant that court gatherings, no matter how regal in appearance, were often suffocating in scent. Despite the wealth and status of the inhabitants, cleaning in royal palaces was minimal. Servants swept floors and removed obvious refuse, but thorough sanitation was unheard of. Rushes or straw were scattered on the floor to absorb spills and waste, but these were rarely changed and became breeding grounds for fleas and lice. Animals such as dogs and cats roamed freely indoors, adding their own contributions to the already overwhelming aroma. The irony is that the royal palace, a symbol of civilization, refinement, and divine authority, was in reality a cacophony of filth. The air was thick with odors, the walls often damp and moldy, and the grand halls concealing the grime of hundreds of daily lives packed into one massive building. Visitors often commented on the smells, and foreign dignitaries sometimes found themselves shocked by the contrast between the visual opulence and the environmental squalor. Reflecting on the past, it's a reminder that privilege and power did not always translate to comfort. The royals of medieval Europe lived lives that were indeed wealthy in material terms, but they were not immune to the same daily discomforts that plagued commoners. In fact, by concentrating more people and more activity into one space, palaces often amplified those problems. The smells of the medieval palace weren't just a minor inconvenience, they were part of daily life, endured without question. Today, we associate palaces with polished marble, fresh flowers, and golden accents. But behind the tapestries of history lies a more human truth. Even kings and queens couldn't escape the stink of their time. Their castles were majestic, yes, but also putrid, pest-ridden, and profoundly unpleasant to the nose. 19. Why monks went months without bathing in the quiet halls of medieval monasteries, where chants echoed and candles flickered against cold stone walls. A strange contradiction lived among the devout, despite valuing purity of spirit. Many monks went for months, or even years without bathing. To modern minds, this seems hard to imagine. How could men dedicated to order, discipline, and devotion neglect something as basic as personal hygiene? The answer lies in the complex relationship between cleanliness, religion, and medieval beliefs about the body and soul. In the Middle Ages, monks belonged to various orders: Benedictines, Cistercians, Franciscans, each with their own rules, but many followed similar principles: humility, poverty, chastity, obedience, and a life removed from worldly pleasures. Physical comfort, including the luxury of bathing, was often seen as a temptation of vanity. To deny the flesh was to strengthen the soul. Bathing was not considered sinful in itself, but it was associated with pride and indulgence. Soap, scented oils, and warm water were seen as distractions from spiritual duty. Some monks believed enduring physical discomfort would bring them closer to God. Water itself was also feared. Medieval people, monks included, believed that bathing could open the body's pores to dangerous vapors and illness. Without the germ theory of disease, many thought that being too clean made you vulnerable. Paradoxically, was seen as a kind of protective layer. During periods of plague or illness, monks often stopped bathing entirely, not out of neglect, but out of self-preservation. Ironically, their efforts to stay healthy may have made conditions worse in communal settings, where diseases thrived in unsanitary environments. Monastic schedules were also rigid and intense. A monk's day began before dawn with prayers and continued in a tightly regulated rhythm of worship, study, manual labor, and meals. There was little time for personal grooming. When bathing did occur, it was usually communal and sparse, perhaps once a month, or only several times per year. In colder climates, it might be avoided altogether during winter months, especially when water had to be heated manually or fetched from frozen wells. Monks wore heavy woolen habits layered year-round, rarely washed, and often crawling with lice and fleas. Hair and beards were left untrimmed for long stretches, and laundry was done infrequently if at all. Despite these conditions, monks did care about basic cleanliness to a degree. They washed their hands before meals and their feet on religious feast days. Some orders built rudimentary washing stations near dining halls or cloisters. But these practices were symbolic acts of humility and ritual purity, rather than efforts to improve bodily hygiene in the modern sense. There were, however, exceptions. In more progressive or urban monasteries, particularly during the 12th and 13th centuries, monks had access to bathhouses and primitive plumbing. Some abbots encouraged bathing once a week or allowed monks to bathe more often if they were elderly or sick. But these were exceptions, not the rule. For many centuries, the default attitude was clear: washing the soul mattered more than washing the body. Looking back, the image of the unwashed monk seems almost ironic, given that monastic communities were often more educated and literate than the general population. They preserved ancient texts, produced beautiful illuminated manuscripts, and shaped theology for centuries. And yet they lived with smells and discomforts that most people today would find intolerable. Their devotion was total, even if it meant embracing dirt and odor as part of their spiritual path. This historical oddity reminds us how deeply culture and belief shape our understanding of health, cleanliness, and virtue. What seemed shocking to us was once seen as noble. In their silence and stillness, monks endured lives not just of isolation, but of physical austerity, believing that true purity had little to do with soap and everything to do with the soul. 20. How to survive in a smelly medieval village. Living in a medieval village meant accepting a world of pungent smells, murky streets, and overwhelming bodily odors as part of daily life. For the average villager, personal hygiene was not a priority but a luxury rarely practiced, often avoided, and hardly expected. To survive in such a world meant more than just adapting to the filth. It meant finding a rhythm in the chaos, a tolerance for the stench, and a strange kind of normalcy in what we would now consider unbearable conditions. The smell of a medieval village was a brutal symphony of unwashed bodies, animal dung, rotting food, and human waste. Most homes had no plumbing, no drainage systems, and often no designated toilets. Waste, both human and animal, was thrown into the streets or dumped into open pits. Rain turned these roads into slushy, contaminated streams, while the summer heat amplified the stench, turning the air thick and oppressive. Villagers might throw a bit of straw or hay onto the roads to soak up the filth, but that only did so much. In many towns, open ditches or gutters ran down the middle of the street, carrying all kinds of refuse right past people's doors. Animals roamed freely through the village: pigs, chickens, goats, and dogs, all of them contributing their own mess. Since many homes were small and cramped, animals were often kept indoors, especially during colder months. The mingling of animal odors with the already overwhelming human ones created a scent that clung to clothing, hair, and homes. Bathing was infrequent at best, and deodorant was unheard of. People simply didn't expect themselves or each other to smell good. Odor was not a source of shame, but a fact of life. To cope, villagers developed certain habits. Herbs and flowers were sometimes carried in pouches or sewn into clothing to mask unpleasant smells. Lavender, mint, or rosemary might be tucked into tunics or tied around wrists. Perfumed pomanders, small scented balls, were hung from belts or necklaces. Churchgoers would occasionally hold scented cloths to their noses during crowded masses. Those who could afford it might dab themselves with rosewater or vinegar mixtures believed to ward off disease. Yet for the majority, these were small gestures against a tidal wave of stench. Laundry was labor-intensive and soap was expensive. Washing clothes meant hauling water from a stream or well, scrubbing garments with coarse lye-based soap, and beating them on stones. It wasn't done often. Clothes were worn until they were visibly filthy or stiff with grime. The idea of changing clothes daily was unthinkable. Many villagers owned only 1 or 2 outfits in their entire lifetime. Underclothes were occasionally washed more frequently, but only if the household had the means and time. Interestingly, despite the overwhelming filth, people developed immune systems adapted to their environments. The constant exposure to bacteria meant that many villagers could tolerate conditions that would make modern people sick almost instantly. Children played in the dirt, adults worked with manure-covered tools, and everyone drank water that was likely teeming with microorganisms. Illnesses still spread, of course, especially during outbreaks of plague or dysentery, but survival often depended on a strong stomach and a stronger intolerance. The local alehouse offered some escape. Beer and ale were safer to drink than water, since the brewing process killed bacteria. People of all ages, including children, drank low-alcohol small beer throughout the day. In that sense, alcohol wasn't just for pleasure, it was survival. It also dulled the senses, making the smells of the village more tolerable. Communal fires, incense in churches, and smoke from cooking fires also added layers of scent that, in a strange way, helped balance or disguise the worst of the odors. Looking back, life in a medieval village seems grim, muddy, cramped, and full of foul air. But to the people who lived it, it was simply the world they knew. They developed rituals and resilience, humor and habits, all shaped by the need to endure. Their survival wasn't just physical, it was psychological. They found comfort in community, purpose in routine, and faith in a world where suffering was seen as a path to salvation. Today, as we turn on hot water with ease, apply deodorant daily, and live in air-conditioned, sanitized comfort, it's easy to forget how recent these luxuries are. The story of the smelly medieval village is not just a tale of grime and odor, it's a reminder of how far we've come, and how much of what we call normal is a fragile, modern invention. To survive in a place like that required grit, adaptability, and above all, a nose that could take a lot more than we ever could. 21. Why toilets were built hanging over castle walls. In the grand stone walls of medieval castles, architectural ingenuity was often driven by necessity rather than comfort. Among the most curious and unglamorous features of these fortresses were the toilets commonly known as garderobes, built to jut out over the outer walls. At first glance, this might seem like a bizarre or even reckless design choice, but in the harsh and pragmatic world of medieval life, it was a solution born of sanitation challenges, military strategy, and sheer practicality. The reason toilets were suspended over the edge of castle walls was straightforward: gravity. There were no indoor plumbing systems or sewage infrastructure. Waste had to go somewhere, and the easiest answer was down. By building garderobes that projected beyond the castle's outer walls, waste could fall directly into a pit, a moat, or the open ground below. far away from living quarters. This helped to keep the interior of the castle relatively free of the overwhelming stench that plagued medieval towns and lower-class homes, where waste might accumulate in cesspits under the floor or be tossed into the sewer. These vertical shafts, often made of stone or wood, were narrow and simple. A wooden bench with a hole was placed over the shaft, and that was it. Some castles even had multiple garderobes stacked above one another, channeling waste down the same chute. In larger castles, several of these toilet chambers might be scattered throughout the walls, giving noble residents and castle guards quick access without needing to walk far. Despite their crude design, they were considered a significant advancement over the alternatives, especially in a world where disease spread easily through human waste. Interestingly, the placement of these toilets also had defensive benefits. Since they were usually located in less accessible outer walls, enemies couldn't easily use them as points of entry. In fact, some castles deliberately designed their garderobes to drop waste into deep moats, making those areas less attractive for attackers to wade through. However, in times of siege, the very same feature became a vulnerability. If invaders managed to climb up the garderobe shaft, it could act as an unguarded tunnel into the heart of the fortress. There are rare but real accounts of soldiers sneaking into castles this way, an unpleasant but effective infiltration method. For those using these high-perched toilets, the experience was undoubtedly cold and uncomfortable. The wind howled through the narrow stone openings, and in winter, the chill could be brutal. There was no privacy, just a wooden door, if you were lucky, and a view straight down. Toilet paper did not exist. Instead, moss, straw, or even discarded fabric might be used for wiping. The smell, while vented away from the castle, was hardly absent. In strong winds, the stench could still find its way back into corridors, especially if the waste pit below wasn't maintained. To castle residents, though, the garderobe was not a symbol of filth, it was a mark of status. Peasants might relieve themselves in ditches or behind barns, but the lords and ladies had the luxury of a designated chamber, however drafty or primitive. Even the name garderobe is telling. It derives from the French word for wardrobe. In some castles, clothes were actually hung near the toilet shaft because the ammonia in the waste below was believed to kill fleas and lice. That tells you everything about the level of hygiene knowledge at the time. What today would be seen as toxic was then viewed as medicinal. Reflecting on this design, we're reminded of a time when even the most powerful had to grapple with the same human needs as everyone else. Castles may have had towers, ballrooms, and banners fluttering in the wind, but behind their majestic walls were cold stone seats perched above a drop of 20 feet or more. It's a humbling detail that brings the Middle Ages down to earth literally. The story of the hanging toilet is not just about medieval plumbing, it's about survival and adaptation. It reveals how even the wealthiest individuals lived without modern sanitation, and how architecture served both function and form in the harsh realities of feudal life. Today, with flushing toilets and warm bathrooms, we often take for granted the clean, efficient ways we deal with waste. But the next time you walk through the remains of a medieval castle, look for the garderobe and imagine what it meant to lean over the edge of history, one uncomfortable moment at a time. 22. Fleas and lice. Everyone had them in medieval world. Fleas and lice were not just unwelcome visitors, they were daily companions to nearly every man, woman, and child. These tiny parasites didn't discriminate by wealth or status. Kings and peasants alike scratched at their scalps and bodies, battling infestations that were simply accepted as a part of life. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was still centuries away, and the science behind disease, pests, and cleanliness remained cloaked in superstition and flawed logic. What we now consider revolting, people in the Middle Ages regarded as normal, almost inevitable. Lice were particularly prevalent. They nested in the seams of clothing, in hair, in beds, and even in religious robes. Since people rarely bathed or changed their clothes, these insects thrived in the warm, unwashed folds of fabric. Combs made specifically for lice, narrow-toothed and carved from bone or wood, were found in many archaeological digs, often among the few personal belongings of even the poorest individuals. A knight might ride into battle with a sword in one hand and a lice comb in his pack. The creatures were so common that finding a louse crawling on your skin or inside your tunic didn't spark panic. It just meant it was another ordinary day. Fleas were just as notorious, especially in urban centers where livestock waste and people crowded together in confined spaces. Animal pens often sat right beside kitchens, and straw bedding rarely changed provided an ideal environment for fleas to multiply. The constant itching and discomfort from flea bites were made worse by the fact that these pests were vectors for deadly diseases. Most infamously, fleas played a role in transmitting the bubonic plague, which devastated Europe in the 14th century. Though medieval people didn't know how the disease spread, They noticed that it followed filth and rodents. Unfortunately, without the knowledge or means to combat it, they were helpless against the swarm. To cope, people turned to both practical tools and strange beliefs. Some wore pouches filled with herbs or dried flowers to ward off pests. Others rubbed their skin with vinegar or ashes, hoping the strong smell would drive the insects away. Superstitions were common charms, prayers, or strange rituals promised protection. But ultimately, the root cause remained dirty clothes, crowded living conditions, and the lack of regular washing created a perfect breeding ground for lice and fleas. What's perhaps most striking is the lack of outrage. Because everyone suffered from these parasites, it became a shared burden, almost woven into the cultural fabric. It wasn't a sign of personal failure, but a fact of human existence. Illustrations from medieval manuscripts sometimes even show monks or scholars absent-mindedly picking lice from their clothingings, like so routine it barely registered as worth hiding. Today we recoil at the idea of sharing our beds or bodies with such creatures, and for good reason. Advances in hygiene, medicine, and public sanitation have largely removed lice and fleas from our daily lives. But in understanding how medieval people lived with these pests, we gain insight into their endurance, their resilience, and their remarkable ability to carry on despite constant discomfort. In the quiet scratching of a monk in his cell, or a child huddled in a straw bed, we glimpse a world that was harsh and deeply human. This story isn't just about insects, it's about the conditions that allowed them to thrive. It reminds us of how far we've come, and how easily we forget the luxury of cleanliness. In a time before soap, shampoos, and exterminators, living with lice and fleas wasn't disgusting, it was simply life. 23. What night smelled like after a medieval battle? A knight did not step off the field bathed in glory and sweet scents. Instead, he carried with him the stench of blood, sweat, mud, horse, and fear. The romanticized image of chivalrous warriors in shining armor clashes harshly with the grim reality of what knights actually smelled like after combat. Beneath their heavy chainmail and layers of padded garments, knights sweated profusely, their bodies encased in fabrics that absorbed every drop of moisture and grime. In some cases, these undergarments were not washed for weeks, especially during a long campaign. As battle raged, the physical exertion, swinging swords, riding horseback, dodging blows produced overwhelming body odor. The padding underneath armor acted like a sponge, trapping sweat and bacteria close to the skin. There were no breathable fabrics, no cooling systems, and certainly no deodorant. After hours in such conditions, a knight's body became a breeding ground for foul smells and skin infections. Chafing, rashes, and heat boils were common, but rarely discussed. The battlefield itself added another rank layer of odor. The metallic scent of fresh blood, the acrid smoke from burning oil or torches, and the fetid stench of open wounds filled the air. If a knight had fallen into a muddy trench, which often doubled as a communal latrine, the filth clung to his boots and clothing for days. The bodies of fallen men and horses added a lingering smell of decay that mixed with the odor of human exertion. Once the fighting ended, there was no shower, no change of clothes, and no respite. Knights rarely had the luxury of private bathing. In fact, bathing itself was viewed with suspicion by many medieval thinkers who believed water could open the pores to disease. Instead, they might wipe their faces with cloth, pour a bit of wine or vinegar over their hands, or simply let the stink settle into their skin. Squires' young attendants to knights sometimes helped their masters remove armor and clean wounds, but thorough washing was not part of the routine. Even the horses added to the unpleasant symphony of smells. A knight's warhorse, or destrier, was a powerful animal, but it too was soaked in sweat and manure by the end of a long march or battle. The smell of animals was considered part of daily life, and few people questioned it. In fact, many knights would have carried the smells of the stable, the camp, and the road with them everywhere they went. Despite all this, knights were admired and celebrated. Their scent, no matter how offensive by modern standards, was likely considered a badge of endurance, a sign that they had survived. Their grimy state may have even been admired as proof of valor and commitment to duty. The harsh smells of medieval warfare weren't just an unpleasant detail, they were a fundamental part of the experience. Every scratch, bruise, and drop of sweat told a story. To the people of the Middle Ages, a knight's odor was not a disgrace. It was evidence of bravery, hardship, and the raw edge of life itself. The modern luxury of soap, clean water, and deodorant distances us from this sensory reality, but it also risks softening our understanding of what it meant to live and fight in such brutal conditions. In the end, the story of what knights smelled like after battle is more than just about stench. It's about how people endured what they accepted as normal, and what they were willing to suffer in the name of honor, glory, or survival. For the medieval knight, smell was not something to hide or scrub away. It was part of the armor they wore into history. 24. Disease spread easily through dirt and grime in the Middle Ages. Disease was an invisible spectre haunting every alley, home, and gathering place, and much of its power stemmed from the filth that defined everyday life. Dirt was not simply part of the environment, it was embedded in the very fabric of medieval existence. Streets were often little more than packed earth, strewn with waste, rotting food, and animal droppings. With no proper sanitation or waste disposal systems, garbage was tossed out of windows, human excrement flowed through open gutters, and livestock shared close quarters with people. In such conditions, disease didn't need an invitation. It spread freely through the grime that clung to bodies, buildings, and belongings. Personal hygiene was inconsistent at best. Many people believed that washing too often was harmful, that water could open the skin to illness, and that bad smells, so-called miasmas, were the true cause of disease. As a result, hands were rarely cleaned before meals, and dirty clothing was reworn until it fell apart. Fleas and lice thrived in unwashed bedding, often carrying pathogens like the bacteria that caused the Black Death. Rats, omnipresent in medieval towns, ran rampant through the same spaces where people ate and slept. It wasn't uncommon for infected rodents to scurry across the kitchen floor or nest in the rafters above where food was stored. Water sources, too, were frequently contaminated. Wells sat dangerously close to latrines, and rivers served double duty as both washing stations and sewers. When people bathed, if they bathed, it was often in shared, murky water that had been used by dozens of others. Even drinking water could be tainted, leading to widespread outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other intestinal diseases. Doctors of the time, lacking knowledge of germs, often prescribed treatments that inadvertently worsened the situation, such as bloodletting or the application of foul-smelling poultices. In the crowded urban centers of Europe, where space was tight and poverty rampant, illness could cut through a population with terrifying speed. An infected person coughing in the marketplace or bleeding into shared water could unknowingly start a chain reaction of suffering. Poor air circulation, lack of ventilation, and close contact between people meant that once a disease arrived, it was difficult to contain. Isolation and quarantine were barely understood, and treatments were based more on superstition than science. What's striking is not just how easily disease spread, but how normalized it was. Sickness and death were everyday realities, woven into the rhythm of medieval life. Parents expected to lose children. Entire families would disappear within weeks during an outbreak. Yet life went on. Markets opened, churches filled, and wars raged despite the ever-present threat of infection. The story of how disease thrived in dirt and grime is a sobering reminder of how deeply environment shapes health. It challenges modern assumptions about cleanliness and reinforces the critical importance of sanitation, hygiene, and public health infrastructure. In a world where germs were unknown and filth was unavoidable, survival itself was a daily victory. What we now wash away without a thought was once a deadly force woven into the very dust of medieval life. 25. Ash and dirt. The medieval way to stay clean in the absence of modern soaps, shampoos, and cleansers. Medieval people turned to whatever was at hand to maintain some semblance of cleanliness, and often that meant ash and dirt. Though it may sound counterintuitive to use grime to combat grime, this rudimentary method of washing was rooted in necessity and tradition. Ash, a byproduct of fire, was coarse and mildly alkaline, and when mixed with water, it could produce a primitive lye solution. This made it surprisingly effective at scrubbing away grease and some forms of filth from skin or fabric. Dirt, especially certain types of fine clay or sandy soil, was sometimes used as a kind of abrasive cleaner, similar in purpose to modern exfoliants. But unlike today's luxurious scrubs, these were harsh, gritty, and could leave the skin raw or irritated. The use of ash and dirt was not limited to peasants. Even among the better off, where access to perfumed waters or herbs might have been more common, ash remained a go-to tool for tasks like laundering or degreasing hair. A woman might rub ashes into her scalp and then rinse it with rainwater, hoping to restore a sense of freshness in a world that rarely smelled pleasant. For those without consistent access to clean water, nearly everyone, this method served as an improvised compromise, a way of preserving dignity in a dirty world. Laundresses, blacksmiths, and even monks used ash for cleaning purposes. It could be mixed with animal fat to make rudimentary soap, though such concoctions were foul-smelling and often reserved for the very dirtiest tasks. Still, they were better than nothing. People would also scrub cooking pots with ashes, wipe down tools, and clean surfaces in their homes, suggesting a kind of intuitive intuiting that ash had cleansing properties, even if they couldn't explain why. In an age without scientific knowledge of bacteria or sanitation, Such practices may have even provided modest hygienic benefits by reducing microbial buildup. But the larger context paints a bleak picture. Ash and dirt weren't used because they were ideal, they were used because there were no better options. Water was scarce or polluted, true soap was expensive, and bathing was rare and often discouraged. The belief that water could carry disease or disrupt the body's balance of humors only reinforced the idea that alternative cleaning methods were safer. People did what they could to stay clean, or at least to feel less filthy, in a world where filth was everywhere. Reflecting on this primitive method of hygiene brings into focus the immense progress humanity has made. What was once a daily struggle finding a way to not feel entirely covered in grime has become so routine for us that we rarely think twice. Yet the creativity, resilience, and practicality of medieval people should not be dismissed. They adapted to their harsh conditions with whatever they could find, even if that meant using the very dust of the earth to ward off the stench of daily life. Ash and dirt may seem like poor substitutes for soap, but for millions, they were all that stood between a sense of cleanliness and the overwhelming squalor of the Middle Ages. 26. Medieval myths about water and illness. In the Middle Ages, water was not seen as a symbol of purity or health. It was often feared as a source of danger and disease. This perception was deeply rooted in both observation and superstition, shaped by generations of people living without access to clean, flowing water. One of the most persistent medieval myths was that water itself, especially when applied to the body, could open the pores and allow illness to seep in. This idea discouraged regular bathing and created a widespread belief that staying dry was essential for good health. The irony, of course, is that avoiding water only increased exposure to filth, disease, and poor hygiene. But in a world without microbiology, these connections were not understood. Doctors and scholars of the time, often guided by the ancient theories of Galen and Hippocrates, believed in the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile as the foundation of health. Any disruption in this balance, including sudden changes in temperature caused by bathing, was thought to bring about illness. Cold water especially was viewed as particularly risky. It was believed that taking a bath during certain seasons, such as winter, could be deadly, and that a body weakened by exposure to water was more vulnerable to epidemics. When plagues ravaged towns, people often blamed contaminated water or overbathing, leading to even more aversion to personal hygiene. Public bathhouses, which were once popular in parts of medieval Europe, gradually fell out of favor, especially after being associated with disease outbreaks or immoral behavior. Religious leaders sometimes condemned them for encouraging vanity and promiscuity, reinforcing the idea that washing the body was both spiritually and physically dangerous. Instead, people turned to dry cleaning methods such as rubbing the skin with cloth, brushing with powders, or using herbs to mask odors. Even kings and nobles sometimes avoided bathing for months, believing they were preserving their health by staying dry. Yet, not all cultures within medieval Europe feared water equally. In Islamic regions of the Middle East and parts of southern Europe influenced by Islamic rule, hygiene practices were more advanced and water was used for regular cleansing, especially in religious rituals. But in northern and western Europe, especially after the collapse of Roman infrastructure, clean water became difficult to access and harder to trust. Wells and rivers were often contaminated, leading to gastrointestinal illnesses that further cemented the myth that water itself caused disease. Looking back, it's easy to scoff at the fear of something as essential and life-giving as water. But these myths were born of real danger. Without understanding of bacteria, without plumbing or sanitation, drinking or bathing in the wrong water source could indeed be fatal. The tragedy is that the fear of water led to less hygiene, which in turn led to more disease, creating a vicious cycle. What seems irrational today made perfect sense in a world of uncertainty, where every choice could mean the difference between life and death. The story of medieval myths about water and illness is not just one of ignorance, it's a story of survival in a time when people grasped for explanations in a world full of unseen threats. It reminds us how much we take for granted in our modern understanding of health, and how science and clean water have transformed not only our bodies, but the way we live our lives. 27. Why bad smells were a sign of wealth in the Middle Ages. The concept of cleanliness was not synonymous with status, as it is today. In fact, quite the opposite was often true. Bad smells, particularly the rich, pungent odors of sweat, perfumes, and unwashed garments, could serve as an unlikely indicator of wealth and nobility. This paradox is rooted in the realities of medieval life, where hygiene practices were vastly different from modern standards, and where strong scents became symbols of power, indulgence, and class separation. Among the upper classes, bathing was often avoided not because they lacked access to water, but because of deeply ingrained medical and cultural beliefs. It was widely thought that bathing opened the pores and made the body more vulnerable to diseases, especially the plague and fevers. Therefore, nobles often abstained from washing regularly and instead relied heavily on perfumes, scented powders, and layers of clothing to mask their natural body odor. To be heavily perfumed, or to exude the musky scent of expensive unwashed fabrics, was to signal that one belonged to a class that didn't need to perform labor or subject themselves to the perceived dangers of water. Perfumes and spices imported from distant lands were costly and difficult to obtain. Only the wealthy could afford to dab rose oil behind their ears, stuff their garments with dried lavender or clove sachets, or wear clothes embroidered with aromatic herbs. These fragrances didn't just serve to cover up unpleasant smells, they were a way to display wealth in a time when the ability to acquire foreign luxuries was closely tied to power and privilege. A noblewoman might be admired for the scent that surrounded her just as much as for her fine jewelry or silks, even if that scent was a blend of exotic perfume and human sweat. Furthermore, many nobles lived in large stone castles that were damp and drafty, with poor ventilation and no proper sewage systems. The combination of animals, humans, chamber pots, and cooking fires contributed to an omnipresent odor that clung to everyone inside. But for the wealthy, these smells weren't necessarily a mark of shame, they were accepted as part of the environment of grandeur and power. In contrast, peasants working in the fields might bathe in streams or lakes more frequently, not out of preference, but out of necessity. Ironically, the poor may have smelled cleaner on some days, but their natural scent was never interpreted as a sign of virtue or refinement. Bad smells were not simply tolerated, they were rationalized, and in some circles even appreciated. In religious and philosophical thought of the era, physical discomfort was often associated with moral strength. Enduring foul odors or unwashed conditions was sometimes viewed as a form of piety or humility. Saints were admired for their ability to live among filth without complaint. Within the court, being surrounded by earthy, robust smells was considered masculine or robust, adding to the mystique of powerful rulers who didn't bother themselves with such delicate matters washing. This peculiar association between bad smells and high status reveals a profound cultural divide between the values of survival and display. In a world where information about germs and infection was non-existent, appearances and scent became tools of social signaling. To be heavily perfumed but never washed, to wear layers of costly fabric without laundering them, was to live in a reality where wealth shielded people not only from manual labor but from the expectations of personal hygiene. The story of how bad smells became a sign of wealth in the medieval world forces us to reconsider how societal norms are shaped not by what is healthy or logical, but by what is powerful and fashionable. It also reminds us that cleanliness, like many other values, has evolved alongside our understanding of science and status. In medieval times, a nobleman's stink might have been as loud as a trumpet, announcing his place in a world where scent was status and hygiene was irrelevant. 28. How medieval people dealt with smelly armpits. The issue of body odor, particularly from the armpits, was an undeniable reality in the Middle Ages, just as it is today. But without access to modern deodorants, antiperspirants, or daily showers, how did medieval people manage this very human problem? The answer lies in a mix of herbal remedies, layered clothing, perfumes, and a cultural mindset that accepted odor as part of everyday life. In medieval towns and villages, the average person did not bathe regularly. Water was often considered dangerous, especially when it was stagnant or shared, and the popular belief was that too much bathing could weaken the body or expose it to disease. Consequently, sweat was a part of life, and armpit odor was a familiar companion, not something to be feared or harshly judged. Rather than eliminating body odor, people focused on masking it. One of the most common approaches was the use of herbs and aromatic plants. Sage, rosemary, thyme, lavender, and mint were all popular choices. These were sometimes crushed and rubbed under the arms or placed in small cloth pouches and tucked inside garments. Wealthier individuals could afford more exotic scents, such as rosewater, musk, or sandalwood oil, which they would apply liberally to their bodies or clothing. These scents helped cover the smell of sweat, at least temporarily. Clothing also played a role in managing body odor. Linen undergarments were considered more hygienic because they could be changed and washed more easily than outer garments. Many medieval people, particularly those of higher social status, wore multiple layers, including an undertunic or chemise made of linen. These garments absorbed sweat and could be laundered more often than woolen overgarments or armor. However, even linen was not washed frequently by today's standards, and the buildup of sweat and grime over days or weeks was inevitable. In monasteries and among the religious elite, special attention was sometimes given to cleanliness, but even then, The focus was more spiritual than hygienic. Ritual washing of the hands and face was common, but full bathing was rare. Monks might rub their underarms with herbal ointments made from vinegar and mint, both believed to have cleansing or deodorizing properties. Still, the effectiveness of these methods was limited, and many simply endured the natural odor of their bodies as part of their earthly existence. Among the working classes, body odor was part of communal life. When everyone smelled to some degree, it became less noticeable or objectionable. Marketplaces, taverns, and homes all carried the scent of unwashed bodies, mingled with the smells of cooking, smoke, and waste. People became accustomed to these odors, and only the most overpowering stench would draw comment. In this context, armpit smell was rarely seen as a personal failing, it was simply a part of life. From a modern perspective, it may be hard to imagine a world where no one used deodorant, but in the Middle Ages, people coped with body odor through social adaptation, herbal solutions, and a very different understanding of hygiene. Smell was less of a private concern and more of a public reality. In fact, the very concept of freshness as we understand it today didn't exist. The nose adjusted, and the culture did too. The way medieval people dealt with smelly armpits reminds us that our expectations around personal hygiene are products of both technology and cultural values. What we consider intolerable today was once natural and unremarkable. It's not that medieval people didn't notice body odor, they just didn't wage war against it the way we do. Instead, they found ways to live with it, to mask it, or to ignore it entirely. In doing so, they created a world where scent was not only a personal matter, but also a reflection of belief, status, and survival. 29. Deadly bathing accidents from the Dark Ages. In the shadowy corridors of the Dark Ages, where superstition mingled with poor sanitation and limited medical knowledge, even something as seemingly simple and necessary as bathing could become a deadly affair. While today a bath is considered a moment of cleansing and relaxation, in medieval times it could quickly turn into a brush with death through a variety of accidents, poor construction, contaminated water, and even social stigma that prevented people from taking necessary precautions. Bathing during the Dark Ages was not an everyday activity. It was infrequent and, depending on one's status and location, could take place in rivers, rudimentary wooden tubs, or communal bathhouses. While the wealthiest nobles sometimes had access to private baths with warm water, peasants and the urban poor had to make do with far more hazardous setups. Rivers and lakes were common places to bathe, but they posed serious risks. People often bathed fully clothed to preserve modesty, and the weight of wet garments sometimes led to drowning, especially if the current was strong. There are records of individuals, particularly women, slipping into rivers and being dragged under by heavy layers of wool and linen. The lack of swimming ability among the general population compounded this risk, and what began as a cleansing act could easily end in a tragic, watery grave. Communal bathhouses, though more organized, brought their own dangers. Many of them were heated using fire beneath wooden or stone tubs, which created two major hazards: accidental burns and structural collapse. It was not unheard of for overheated bathhouses to catch fire. With no smoke detectors or modern firefighting equipment, flames could engulf the building in minutes, trapping and killing the boys inside. Likewise, the stones used to heat the water were sometimes placed beneath thin wooden platforms. If not properly supported, a bather might fall through into scalding water embers, suffering severe burns or death. Furthermore, the very act of sitting in warm water was believed by some medieval scholars to open the pores and weaken the body's defenses, making one vulnerable to illness. This belief wasn't entirely unfounded if the water was contaminated, as it often was. Exposure could indeed lead to infections, particularly in an era without antibiotics or antiseptics. There are tales of noblemen who bathed luxuriously only to fall ill within days, the dirty water blamed for their sudden demise. Without understanding germ theory, such deaths were often attributed to bad air or divine punishment, reinforcing the fear that bathing might be more dangerous than going unwashed. Even among monks and religious communities, bathing accidents occurred. Cloistered baths were built with simple plumbing that sometimes failed. If a drain backed up or the water source was fouled, the stagnant water could become a breeding ground for disease. Occasionally, these poorly ventilated rooms would fill with steam or fumes, leading to dizziness, fainting, and in rare cases, suffocation. There are chronicled instances of monks collapsing in bath chambers, either from heat exhaustion or asphyxiation from a lack of airflow. These fatal incidents, though not common enough to stop bathing entirely, contributed to a general anxiety about cleanliness. The church, which already promoted modesty and suspicion of bodily pleasure, often used such stories as cautionary tales. The death of a sinner in a bathhouse was interpreted as divine retribution for vanity or indulgence. The result was a widespread belief that not only was bathing unnecessary, it might actually be harmful, both physically and spiritually. Looking back, it is tragic and fascinating to realize how something so life-affirming could become life-threatening. The very idea of a deadly bath seems absurd to the modern mind, but in the world of the Dark Ages, it was a reality shaped by ignorance, poor infrastructure, and fatal coincidence. These stories serve as a reminder that even the most ordinary acts of life, eating, sleeping, bathing, were once deeply uncertain and often dangerous. And they help us understand how fear, rather than cleanliness, came to dominate the medieval view of hygiene. 30. When churches banned bathing as sinful, in the complex and superstitious world of the Middle Ages, where spiritual salvation took precedence over physical health, an unusual and disturbing idea began to take root, that bathing, the act of washing one's body with water, could be sinful. To the modern observer, this notion seems absurd. Cleanliness is not only seen as hygienic but morally neutral or even virtuous. However, in the medieval mind, especially under the growing influence of the church, physical cleanliness was gradually viewed as a gateway to spiritual corruption, indulgence, and vanity. And so it happened that in certain periods and regions of medieval Europe, bathing was not only frowned upon, it was banned outright by religious authorities. The roots of this ban lie in both religious philosophy and fear. Early Christianity promoted asceticism, the belief that denying the body's pleasures was a path to spiritual purity. Bathing, especially when done communally or with scented oils and warm water, was considered luxurious, too sensual, too focused on the physical body rather than the soul. The body, according to church teaching, was a vessel of temptation. To pamper it with warm baths, to enjoy the comfort of cleanliness, was to indulge the flesh, and that indulgence could lead to lust, pride, or sloth, or cardinal sins. As Roman bathhouses fell into disrepair after the collapse of the empire, their association with paganism, promiscuity, and sexual immorality tainted the very act of bathing. Many Roman bathhouses were places where men and women mingled, and sometimes engaged in more than just hygiene. In the eyes of church leaders, these structures became symbols of corruption. Over time, communal bathing, especially between sexes, was strictly forbidden. In some regions, public bathhouses were closed, and priests preached against the practice from the pulpit, warning the faithful that cleanliness of the body meant nothing if the soul was filthy with sin. There were even written condemnations by prominent religious figures. By the 12th and 13th centuries, sermons began to appear that linked frequent bathing of vanity and moral weakness. Bishops warned that those who bathed too often were likely obsessed with appearance and thus straying from God's path. Some monastic orders implemented strict rules limiting or banning bathing entirely except for medical necessity. Monks and nuns would go months, sometimes years, without a full bath, believing their discomfort brought them closer to divine grace. But the church's fear of bathing wasn't just about vanity, it was also about proximity. Bathing often took place in communal settings where nakedness was unavoidable. The sight of the unclothed human form was believed to stir lust, even among the devout. Mixed-gender bathhouses were not uncommon in early medieval Europe, and their existence created unease among conservative clergy. To prevent sin, the church sought to eliminate temptation altogether, and that meant eliminating bathing. The irony of the church's stance is stark. In trying to protect souls, it neglected bodies. With the rise of these religious bans, cities grew filthier. Diseases like the plague, cholera, and typhus spread more easily in the grime of unwashed streets and unbathed bodies. The link between cleanliness and health was not yet understood, and in some ways these bans on bathing may have accelerated the spread of illness during Ile. The spiritual fear of bathing made no distinction between moral danger and microbial threat. This historical episode stands as a somber testament to the power of ideology and its potential to override reason and compassion. While the church's intentions may have stemmed from a sincere desire to guide people towards spiritual discipline, the result was a cultural disdain for cleanliness that endured for centuries. People learned to associate dirt with devotion and purity of the soul with impurity of the body. And yet, buried in this strange chapter of history is a lesson. When fear dictates our understanding of the world, when ideology blinds us to physical reality, the consequences can be widespread and deeply harmful. The story of the church banning bathing is not merely about soap and water. It is about how power defines virtue and how definitions of virtue can shape and sometimes endanger everyday life. 31. Water carriers, heroes of the dirty streets in the sprawling, grime-coated cities of the medieval world, where filth clung to cobblestones and disease lurked in every puddle. There existed a class of unsung heroes who labored not with sword or scripture, but with wooden buckets and aching backs. They were the water carriers, lowly workers in the social hierarchy. yet indispensable to the daily survival of their communities. While nobles bathed in privilege and clergy preached from high pulpits, it was these humble laborers who trudged through the chaos of unclean streets, hauling gallons of water from wells, rivers, or communal fountains into homes, inns, taverns, and even castles. Their job was brutally physical, frequently thankless, and often invisible. Yet without them, medieval life, already teetering on the edge of dysfunction, would have descended even further into squalor. At first glance, one might assume carrying water was a simple task. But in a time before plumbing, pumps, or sewage systems, water carriers were a crucial artery in the fragile oi. Most homes had no access to fresh water. Even wealthier households needed regular deliveries, especially for cooking, brewing, or cleaning. The poor, lacking both time and strength, relied on water sellers who could make dozens of trips a day. A single bucket could weigh over 40 pounds when full, and many carriers bore 2 or 3 at once, balanced on their shoulders or strung from poles. Their clothes were perpetually soaked, their muscles perpetually strained. Worse yet, the paths they walked were not gentle cobblestone walkways but narrow alleys slick with mud, animal waste, and the offal of daily life. Human waste was often dumped from windows with a casual shout of warning if there was a warning at all. Slipping, stumbling, and spilling water was a daily risk. And with each spill came not just frustration but the prospect of starting the task all over again. Time was money, and a wet tunic offered little warmth during harsh winters. Water carriers occupied a strange social space. They were vital, yet often ignored. While bakers and blacksmiths had shops, tools, and guilds to give them some dignity, water carriers were usually day laborers, poor men, and sometimes women, who worked to the point of collapse for a few coins. They smelled of damp wood and sour water, their hands cracked from cold, and their backs hunched from weight. They had no titles, no inheritance, and no protection from the diseases that often lingered in the very water they carried. Despite this, they were, in a way, silent guardians of public health, not in any institutional sense, but simply by virtue of moving clean water into places where it could displace filth. In hospitals and monasteries, their arrival signaled the chance for healing, cleaning, or prayer. In taverns, they made ale possible, and in homes, they provided mothers with enough water to wash their children or brew broth for the sick. Without them, the fragile barrier between civilization and chaos would crumble. In times of plague, water carriers became even more critical and even more endangered. As fear of contagion grew, many people avoided public wells. Water carriers risked infection daily as they moved between households, sometimes unknowingly spreading disease, but often simply enduring its horrors in silence. Many died anonymously, their contributions erased from the historical record. And yet, their quiet labor remains a powerful symbol. The water carrier reminds us that progress is not always made by grand invention or noble decree, but often by the relentless, exhausting effort of those at the bottom. They bore no banners. They had no power. But through their sweat and suffering, they helped cities function barely, desperately, but function nonetheless. In reflecting on their role, we must recognize that true heroism often lies where we least expect it, not in armor or throne rooms, but in the trudging steps of the forgotten, those who carry burdens so others may drink, eat, or simply live. The water carrier's life was soaked in hardship, but within that hardship was a kind of dignity no poverty could strip away. 32. Waste was thrown from windows, without warning, in the dense, labyrinthine cities of medieval Europe, where towering stone houses leaned precariously over crooked streets. Life was loud, chaotic, and overwhelmingly unclean. One of the most infamous practices of the time was the casual and constant act of waste disposal through the very windows from which people greeted neighbors, watched the world pass, or called out the ha. From chamber pots filled with the night's urine to buckets of kitchen scraps, the contents of daily living were hurled into the streets below without much thought or care. The notion of sanitation, as we know it today, did not exist. Instead, people simply opened a shutter and tossed whatever they needed to dispose of into the street, sometimes with a shouted warning like "Garde à l'eau," in French towns meaning "watch out for the water." Though many didn't even bother, the streets became rivers of filth. Human excrement mixed with the blood from butchers, the refuse from fishmongers, and the dung of countless horses and pigs that roamed freely. In dry weather, the stench would hang in the air like an oppressive fog. In wet weather, the muck turned to sludge and soaked through boots and hems. Children played in these streets. Merchants sold goods near open sewers. Rats thrived. Disease had fertile ground to flourish. And all of it, every part of that environmental chaos, was routinely fed by the simple act of people tossing waste from their windows, an act so common that it was as unremarkable as lighting a candle or sweeping a floor. For the unlucky passerby, a stroll through the city was an exercise in vigilance. It was not uncommon for someone to be struck by the sudden downpour of a stranger's chamber pot, an indignity that no amount of social status could entirely shield one from. Hats helped. So did moving quickly. But nothing could truly protect you from the randomness of human disregard when windows were transformed into vertical toilets. Those living on the ground floors or working in the streets, especially beggars, vendors, and street performers and street buyers, they lived under a constant threat of filth from above, as if the heavens themselves had turned against them. This careless disposal wasn't simply born from laziness, but from a lack of infrastructure and understanding. Sewers, if they existed, were crude. Plumbing was rare and usually reserved for monasteries, castles, or wealthy urban estates. Most households lacked any internal system for waste, and there were few laws regulating its disposal. When attempts were made by local governments to curb the behavior, they were often ignored or unenforced. After all, when nearly everyone was doing it, it became a normalized part of life, even if that life reeked of rot and danger. Yet this grim detail of medieval existence teaches us something more than just the perils of sanitation ignorance. It shows how the absence of collective care of responsibility for shared spaces can transform everyday actions into threats. Throwing waste from a window might have been a necessity, but the frequency with which it occurred without warning reveals a society desensitized to the effects of their own behavior. The communal environment was sacrificed for convenience. What should have been a shared concern, cleanliness, public health, and basic dignity, was instead abandoned in favor of individual ease. In today's world, where sanitation is taken for granted in many places, the memory of waste-filled medieval streets seems almost absurd. But it stands as a stark reminder: progress in cleanliness, hygiene, and public health was neither easy nor automatic. It came only after cities were ravaged by plague, after the cost of filth was counted in bodies and suffering, after people realized that streets cannot be shared if they are not respected. The foul rain from the windows of medieval towns was not just a problem of plumbing, it was a reflection of a deeper disconnection between personal actions and communal consequences. And so, while the image may be grotesque, it is instructive. Civilization, in part, is defined by how we treat our shared spaces and by the effort we're willing to make to keep others safe from what we might too easily dismiss as just waste. The past teaches us not only about the dangers of what once was, but about the responsibilities we still carry, window to street, person to person. 33. Funny and gross. Tales from medieval bathrooms in the winding corridors of medieval castles and the cramped corners of peasant cottages. There existed a world of bathroom habits that were as amusing as they were grotesque. Unlike the private porcelain sanctuaries we know today, medieval bathrooms were often public, rudimentary, and a source of both gossip and embarrassment. These spaces, if one could even call them that, gave rise to countless bizarre stories and uncomfortable realities, offering a strangely intimate glimpse into daily life in the Middle Ages. Take, for example, the classic castle garderobe, a small stone protrusion built out from a tower wall with a hole that dropped waste straight down into the open air or a moat below. These cold, drafty chambers were barely more than closets with a hole, and many a nobleman or visiting guest found themselves perched in quiet discomfort above the open abyss. One story tells of a noble being rudely interrupted mid-relief by a surprise attack. Invading soldiers had scaled the wall and attempted entry through the garderobe chute. One can only imagine the utter horror of being ambushed from below in such a vulnerable position. It may sound like a bad joke today, but for medieval inhabitants, this was an unfortunate and oddly common reality. Then there were the communal latrines of monasteries, often long benches with several holes carved side by side. These were places not just for relieving oneself, but for silent meditation or not-so-silent conversations. Some monks would find themselves distracted by the sounds, smells, or unexpected laughter that echoed in the stone chambers. The cloister walls might have kept out worldly noise, but they amplified every creak and squelch of human nature. It's even said that some monks wrote verses complaining of the gassy hymns they heard during evening bathroom visits. In the towns and villages, chamber pots were the go-to solution. Kept under beds or beside chairs, these ceramic or wooden vessels were often shared among family members. Children were sometimes tasked with emptying them, a job they didn't relish, and often performed with less than perfect accuracy. There's a well-known tale of a young boy in York who, too sleepy one early morning, accidentally emptied the contents of the chamber pot into the family's cooking kettle. The stew that day was reportedly richer than usual, though the truth was only discovered later when the cook fainted at the memory. Whether apocryphal or not, such stories reflect the messy intimacy of medieval domestic life. Bathroom humor, it seems, is eternal. Even in royal courts, bodily functions were an unspoken part of politics. Kings and queens had personal groomer, the stool attendants, whose job was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds. Trusted with wiping the monarch and keeping their secrets, these attendants were privy to both physical and political matters. Some rose to positions of real influence, simply because of how often they were alone with the ruler in their most unguarded moments. That someone could rise through the ranks thanks to royal excrement is both funny and strangely logical in a world so steeped in hierarchy and bodily reality. But beyond the humour and horror, these tales from medieval bathrooms reflect a world deeply human and often shockingly familiar. Hygiene may have been poor and the architecture lacking, but people still found ways to cope, to laugh, and to bond over shared awkwardness. Much like today's office bathroom gossip or accidental encounters, medieval people dealt with the unavoidably embarrassing aspects of life by telling stories, poking fun, and when necessary shifting blame onto the dog. What these stories ultimately show is that civilization, no matter how regal or pious, is still tied to the very basic needs of the body. The medieval world wasn't just one of grand cathedrals and knightly honour, it was also a place where people slipped on chamber pot spills or argued over who used the last handful of straw, and tried to agooze a coming from the smell coming from the floor above. By embracing these awkward truths with humour, medieval people turned even the most unpleasant parts of life into something communal, something laughable, and strangely, something comforting. And perhaps that's the real lesson buried beneath the muck, that dignity doesn't come from avoiding the mess, but from learning to live with it, laughing all the while. 34. Why bathing too often was thought to be deadly. In the flickering candlelight of medieval Europe, where superstition often stood in place of science, and doctors relied as much on astrology as anatomy, a curious and deeply rooted fear took hold of society, a fear of bathing. Today, a warm bath is seen as cleansing, relaxing, and restorative, but to many medieval people, it was a gateway to illness, even death. The belief that bathing too often could be deadly was not merely a misunderstanding of hygiene, but a worldview shaped by medical theory, social anxiety, and religious doctrine. The dominant medical theory of the time was the humoral system, inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates. According to this model, the body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and health depended on keeping them in balance. Bathing, especially hot bathing, was believed to open the pores and soften the flesh, making the body vulnerable to invasion by harmful vapors and corrupted air, known as miasma. In a time before germ theory, people thought disease came not from bacteria or viruses, but from invisible poisons in the air. When the skin's protective grime was washed away and the pores left open, those deadly vapors could seep into the body, causing fevers, chills, and sometimes death. This fear was especially strong during times of plague and epidemic. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, doctors advised people not to bathe. Bathhouses, once lively centers of social life, were closed or abandoned. The connection between cleanliness and health was not yet understood. In fact, the opposite seemed true. To survive, people believed, one needed to seal their skin with layers of dirt and sweat, forming a natural barrier against sickness. A clean body was an exposed body, and exposure meant danger. Yet this belief wasn't born only from fear, it was also a reflection of class and piety. For the poor, frequent bathing was often impractical, as clean water was a luxury and public bathhouses were not always accessible or affordable. For the devout, especially within monastic communities, bathing was sometimes viewed with suspicion. It was seen as indulgent, sensual, even sinful. Many saints were praised for their unwashed bodies, their refusal to cleanse as a sign of spiritual strength. Dirt became a badge of honor, an outward sign of inward purity. There are even recorded royal cases that illustrate this widespread anxiety. King Louis IX of France, later canonized as St. Louis, was reputed to have bathed only twice in his life, once at birth, and once before his wedding. This wasn't because he lacked the means to wash, but because even royalty was subject to the same beliefs. Cleanliness was not only unnecessary, it was dangerous, unholy, and unnatural. Of course, not everyone accepted these ideas. Some nobles and city dwellers still used bathhouses and perfumes. Medieval Islamic societies, which maintained a stronger tradition of cleanliness, viewed regular bathing as both healthy and religiously important. But in much of Christian Europe, the fear remained deeply ingrained. Even the invention of soap could not fully overcome it, as many still thought bathing stripped the body of its defenses. Looking back, this belief might seem absurd, even tragic. How many lives were lost not because of dirt, but because of the fear of removing it? Yet this story also reminds us of how powerful ideas can shape behavior, even when they run counter to observation or reason. In the absence of accurate science, people build their understanding from the tools they have: myth, fear, faith, and tradition. Today, we recognize the importance of hygiene and understand the dangers of bacteria, viruses, and poor sanitation. But the medieval fear of bathing offers a sobering lesson that misinformation, when widely believed, can be just as dangerous as any disease. It also teaches us to be humble about our own assumptions. What we see as obvious now was once feared as fatal. And who knows, perhaps centuries from now, people will look back on our own medical habits with a pat same mixbehal, this disbelief and sympathy. 35. Cleaning wounds with wine and ash in the shadowy chambers of medieval castles and war-torn fields, where steel clashed against flesh and life often hung by a thread. The treatment of wounds was both an act of desperation and raw ingenuity. With no modern antiseptics, antibiotics, or even a clear understanding of how infection worked, medieval healers turned to the resources they trusted: wine and ash. Today, it may seem like a curious, even reckless combination, but for the people of the Middle Ages, it was a symbol of hope, healing, and survival in a brutal world. When a soldier was cut down in battle or a villager suffered a festering injury, the priority was simple: stop the bleeding and prevent death. Surgeons of the time, often barbers by trade, not doctors by education, worked with rudimentary tools and instincts born from experience rather than knowledge. They had no concept of bacteria, and yet, through trial and error, some of their methods carried surprising merit. Wine, especially the strong and bitter kinds common in Europe, was among the most prized wound treatments. It was poured directly into open wounds to cleanse them, and though they could not have known why, this practice had some real benefit. The alcohol in the wine acted as a mild disinfectant, killing some bacteria and preventing the worst of infections. Ash, on the other hand, was more mystical and symbolic, though it too had practical uses. Collected from burned wood or herbs, ash was often mixed with water, oil, or even animal fat to make a paste. Applied to wounds, it could help dry out moisture, form a protective crust, and in some cases reduce bleeding. The gritty texture allowed it to absorb pus or fluid, and the high pH might have discouraged bacterial growth. In a world without bandages or sterile gauze, ash was a kind of primitive poultice readily available and easy to apply. Sometimes it was even combined with honey, lard, or plant extracts to form salves passed down through generations. But behind these treatments lay a worldview shaped by both religion and superstition. Wine, blessed and sacred in Christian rituals, was thought to carry spiritual as well as medicinal power. Ash, the symbolic remnant of fire, was linked to purification, death, and rebirth. When healers sprinkled ash into a wound or washed it with wine, they were not just treating the body, they were invoking the sacred and aligning their actions with divine will. Healing, in their eyes, required both practical effort and spiritual grace. Of course, not every treatment worked, and many wounds turned septic, especially in the absence of cleanliness. Amputations were common, often without anesthesia, and death from infection was seen as a grim but natural end. Yet the use of wine and ash reflected a deeper human instinct to fight against suffering with whatever tools were at hand, and to bring comfort in the face of agony. This practice also speaks to the broader resilience of medieval people. They lived in a world filled with danger, war, famine, disease, and superstition, but they did not surrender. They adapted, improvised, and relied on tradition, observation, and faith. Their methods, though flawed by modern standards, were part of a continuous effort to push back against the chaos of nature and fate. Reflecting on this history reminds us how far medical science has come, but also how much of it is built on centuries of trial and error. It's easy to scoff at the idea of rubbing ash into a wound or cleaning it with sour wine, but in doing so, we miss the quiet courage of those who've performed these acts, and the desperate hope performed. In our sanitized hospitals and pharmaceutical labs, we owe a debt, however strange it may seem, to the hands that once shook with fear and determination as they poured wine into a bleeding wound and prayed that ash might somehow bring healing. Their story is not one of ignorance, but of bravery in the face of darkness. 36. Castle latrines and their deadly drop high atop the towering stone walls of medieval castles, where banners fluttered in the wind and archers scanned distant horizons. There existed a darker, far less romantic feature, one often hidden behind heavy wooden doors or tucked into narrow alcoves. These were the castle latrines, known as garde-robes, and though they served a humble yet vital function, they also carried with them a surprising and sinister danger. To understand medieval life fully, one must descend into this forgotten corner of castle architecture where daily necessity met life-threatening design. Garde-robes were the medieval equivalent of bathrooms, but they were far from private or sanitary by modern standards. Typically built into the outer walls of castles, these narrow stone rooms were often little more than shafts that led directly to the open air, with a wooden seat perched over the drop. Waste would fall through the opening and land either in a cesspit, a moat, or simply on the ground below, depending on the design and the castle's location. To the medieval mind, this made sense. It kept the filth outside the living quarters, used gravity to do the work, and ensured that nature or servants would deal with the rest. But this clever design came with serious risks. The deadly drop beneath the latrine seat was not just an architectural hazard, it was a potential death sentence. There are chilling stories passed down through chronicles and castle lore of soldiers and servants accidentally falling into these foul shafts, especially during nighttime visits when lighting was poor and the cold made footing slippery. A misstep, a rotted board, or even a shove from behind could mean plummeting into a pit of waste with little chance of survival. The fall alone might kill a person, but if not, drowning in excrement or succumbing to infection shortly afterward surely would. Even more disturbing were instances during wartime when enemies exploited latrines as points of vulnerability. These waste chutes, though narrow, sometimes provided a hidden passage into the heart of a castle. There are historical accounts of invaders climbing up latrine shafts to bypass the outer walls, emerging filthy but armed, taking defenders by surprise. In such cases, the very design meant to expel waste became a Trojan horse for the enemy. Despite their grim nature, garderobes were not considered a mark of poverty or neglect. In fact, some castles had multiple latrines, one for the lord, others for guests or the garrison. They were signs of relative sophistication, and even royalty had to answer nature's call. The name garderobe itself hints at a peculiar dual purpose. Some nobles would hang their clothing in these small chambers, believing that the ammonia from the waste below would repel moths and lice. In this sense, the latrine was not just a toilet, it was a medieval wardrobe cleaner. Latrines also reflected the hierarchical structure of medieval life. While the nobility relieved themselves in relative comfort over high walls, the poor often made do with chamber pots or public cesspits in the streets below. Waste disposal was a matter of status, just like food or fashion, and the castle latrine was yet another reminder of the social divide that ran through every part of medieval society. The story of castle latrines is both practical and haunting. It is a reminder that life in the Middle Ages, even within the most powerful strongholds, was never truly safe. Danger came not only from siege engines and swords, but from the very structures meant to protect and serve. The latrine, a place of private relief, could become a trapdoor to death. And yet, in this dark corner of history, we glimpse the ingenuity and struggle of medieval life. These were people who, with limited materials and knowledge, sought to solve basic human needs amid the demands of war, politics, and survival. Their solutions may seem crude now, even grotesque, but they were born of necessity and the will to endure. In contemplating the deadly drop of a castle latrine, we are not just peering into a hole in the wall, we are looking into a world where every detail of life was a negotiation with danger, and where even the most ordinary acts carried the weight of mortality. 37. Fancy castles, but terrible toilets beneath the soaring towers, glittering banners, and intricately carved stonework of medieval castles lay a truth that few would dare whisper: the toilets were terrible. While castles are often portrayed as the grand homes of kings and queens, brimming with luxury, feasts and finery, their sanitation told a very different story. Behind those thick stone walls, where nobility plotted wars and knights pledged loyalty, the most basic of human functions was met with crude, smelly, and often dangerous solutions. The irony is striking. Places built to represent the peak of civilization were plagued by one of the lowest standards of hygiene. In the grand halls of castles you might find elaborate tapestries, golden goblets, and furniture crafted by master artisans. Yet just steps away, the toilet facilities were primitive at best. Most castles used what were called garderobes, which were small stone rooms jutting out over the edge of castle walls, often with a simple wooden seat placed over a hole. These holes led directly outside, where human waste would either fall into a cesspit or into the castle moat, turning that defensive feature into a reeking, disease-ridden swamp. Even in the most sophisticated fortresses, the concept of plumbing as we know it today was non-existent. Waste management relied on gravity, luck, and occasionally servants who had the misfortune of being tasked with cleaning the refuse. There was no running water, no flushing system, and definitely no hand soap or towels. Smells wafted through stone corridors, especially during hot months when the stench grew unbearable. Some castle designers tried to remedy this by placing garderobes near chimneys or installing multiple latrines to prevent overcrowding. But none of these efforts truly resolved the issue. What's even more surprising is that many nobles did not consider this a problem. Bathing was infrequent and misunderstood, often avoided for fear of illness. A noble might go weeks or even months without a proper wash, believing that hot water could open the pores to disease. With this mindset, toilets were seen more as inconvenient necessities than crucial elements of daily health. Privacy, too, was scarce. Garderobes were often shared, and the lack of ventilation meant that smells clung to rooms and people alike. The luxurious lives of the elite, it turned out, were only skin deep. This dissonance between architectural beauty and bodily neglect speaks volumes about medieval priorities. Castles were built first for defense, then for status, and only much later, if at all, for comfort. Sanitation was an afterthought, not a foundation. The focus was on keeping enemies out, not keeping disease away. Ironically, the greatest threats to a castle's inhabitants often came from within through filth, germs, and the very air they breathed. There's a peculiar lesson in this contrast. It reminds us that even the grandest surroundings cannot mask the realities of daily life. No matter how tall the towers or how richly adorned the chambers, humans remain humans with needs that cannot be ignored or aesthetically dressed. It also shows us how far we've come in understanding health, comfort, and dignity. Today, a basic toilet is a right, not a luxury. In medieval times, it was barely an afterthought in the most luxurious places on earth. The terrible toilets of fancy castles challenge our romantic notions of history. They ground the glory in grime, the opulence in odor. And in doing so, they offer a humbling reminder that real progress is not in gold or stone, but in clean water, safe sanitation, and respect for the simple needs that unite us all, across centuries and class. 38. Why nobles didn't mind smelling bad in the lavish courts of medieval Europe, where nobles adorned themselves with silks, jewels, and powdered wigs. One might assume that personal hygiene matched their opulent tastes. Yet beneath the layers of fine clothing and elaborate etiquette, there lingered an undeniable truth. Nobles often smelled quite terrible, and they didn't mind. In fact, in a world where bathing was rare and perfume reigned supreme, bad odors were not just tolerated, they were overlooked, normalized, and in some cases even seen as symbols of status. The reasons behind this peculiar indifference to bodily odor were both cultural and medical. During the Middle Ages and well into the Renaissance, the dominant belief was that water, especially hot water, could open the pores and let disease seep into the body. Bathing too frequently was viewed as risky, even dangerous. As a result, many nobles avoided washing their bodies, choosing instead to mask their natural scent with layers of perfume, aromatic herbs, or soil-scented garments. Rather than a clean body, a noble was expected to present a fragrant cloud of rosewater, musk, or lavender regardless of what lay underneath. Clothing further complicated matters. Nobles wore multiple layers linen undergarments, woolen gowns, velvet cloaks, and these were rarely washed. Linen might be changed occasionally, but outer garments were spot cleaned at best. Without regular laundering or bathing, sweat, oils, and environmental dirt accumulated. The sheer volume of fabric could trap odors close to the skin, creating a musty, unwashed presence that even the finest perfumes couldn't fully conceal. Still, as long as one appeared well-dressed and scented, this was considered acceptable, even fashionable. Perhaps more telling is how deeply class played into perceptions of smell. For the peasantry, bad odor was often associated with hard labor and poverty. Yet for nobles, it was cloaked in a different light. Since they had the luxury of avoiding manual work and could afford imported perfumes, the aristocracy viewed themselves as above the realm of common smells, even if their hygiene habits suggested otherwise. In many cases, bad odors were simply not discussed or were attributed to the natural order of things. Scent was not yet understood in scientific terms. It was a vague sensory experience, sometimes linked to morality or temperament, but not always to health. Moreover, smell was so prevalent in everyday life on streets, in homes, in markets and churches that it lost its shock value. Chamber pots were emptied into open drains, animals roamed freely, and sanitation was rudimentary. In such a context, the scent of unwashed flesh might blend into the broader aroma of medieval living. For nobles who spent their time in stone castles with poor ventilation and limited plumbing, a certain level of foulness was simply part of the atmosphere. One adapted, one endured. And then there was pride. For some nobles, frequent washing was associated with vanity or softness, traits unbecoming of the rugged, stoic ideal of medieval masculinity or the reserved grace of aristocratic femininity. Enduring discomfort, including one's own stench, became a form of silent strength. Cleanliness was spiritual, not physical. Inner purity mattered more than outer freshness. Looking back, it's tempting to mock this worldview, to laugh at perfumed nobles reeking beneath their gowns. But the truth is more nuanced. Their attitudes reflect the limitations of the era's knowledge, the power of tradition, and the way culture shapes even the most personal aspects of life. They remind us that what seems obvious today, like the value of soap and water, was once obscured by fear, myth, and custom. In the end, the noble indifference to body odor is a reminder of how privilege can insulate people from their own flaws, and how appearances often matter more than reality. Their scented denial masked a deeper truth, that no amount of wealth or status can hide the human need for cleanliness. It also offers a sobering reflection on our own blind spots. What habits of ours, considered normal now, will future generations find absurd? The nobles didn't mind smelling bad because no one dared tell them they did. 39. Medieval shoes were made for stepping in filth in the bustling, mucky streets of medieval Europe, where chamber pots were dumped from windows and livestock wandered freely. A person's shoes became both shield and surrender. They were crafted not for comfort, style, or long journeys, but simply for survival in a world where filth was an everyday reality. The shoes of the Middle Ages tell a story that's not stitched in leather alone, but soaked in mud, waste, and practicality. While nobles might boast pointed pointers with extravagantly long toes, and peasants wore crude clogs or leather soles tied to their feet with strips of cloth or twine, they all had one thing in common: none of them could keep out the filth. The streets of medieval towns were narrow and crowded. Drainage was poor or non-existent, meaning waste from households, animals, and market stalls pooled in the gutters or simply in the middle of the street. Without sewers, public sanitation, or any concept of waste management as we know it, roads became rivers of refuse. Walking from one end of a town to another could mean trudging through layers of manure, rotting food, blood from butchered animals, and worse. Rain only made things worse, turning dust into sludge, and streets into slippery traps. The shoes themselves were not built to fight this. Most medieval footwear was thin, soft, and made from untreated leather. Soles were often just a few millimeters thick, offering minimal protection from the damp and disease-ridden muck below. For commoners, shoes were practical but expendable, something you patched until they could no longer be patched, and then remade from scraps. For wealthier folk, shoes were symbolic, decorative, and often absurdly impractical. Pointed shoes several inches long dragged through the dirt, gathering grime like a sponge. Some nobles even had to tie the toes of their shoes to their knees to keep from tripping over themselves. To mitigate the daily filth, some people wore wooden patterns, essentially raised platforms strapped beneath their regular shoes. These clunky contraptions elevated wearers above the worst of the mud, but they were noisy, awkward, and not easily worn indoors. Still, they provided a layer of defense in a world where human waste might slosh against your ankles. What makes medieval shoes even more tragic is how deeply they reflected the times. Footwear was not merely about getting from place to place, it was a response to the environment, to poverty, to class, and to custom. The rich could afford multiple pairs and perhaps a servant to clean them. The poor often went barefoot when shoes wore out. And everyone, regardless of status, was forced to navigate a world that didn't yet understand germs, hygiene, or disease transmission. Shoes in the medieval era also came with unspoken risks. Cuts on the foot from worn soles or sharp debris in the muck could lead to infections. A simple blister could fester into something deadly in the age before antibiotics. Every step, quite literally, carried danger. Reflecting on medieval shoes leads us to a larger observation. Human adaptation is often shaped more by endurance than innovation. People didn't have better shoes because they lacked the materials or ideas, they lacked the incentive. When filth is everywhere, the goal isn't to stay clean, it's to get through the day. Shoes became a symbol of that grim determination, of people pressing forward through discomfort, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. In modern times, with our engineered soles, waterproof linings, and indoor plumbing, it's easy to forget how fragile our cleanliness once was. Medieval shoes were not a design failure, they were a mirror of a dirty, dangerous world. And they remind us that civilization isn't measured by fashion, but by whether or not your morning walk requires stepping over a stream of sewage. Thank you. Here is the detailed story and commentary for topic 40, and I'm ready to continue with the rest whenever you are. Let me know if you want to shift focus or adjust the writing style. 40. Candles were used to mask the smell of death in the Middle Ages. Candles were more than just sources of light, they were essential tools in the eternal struggle against the stench of decay. Unlike our modern world, where cleaning agents, air fresheners, and sealed coffins mask the unpleasant realities of death, medieval people faced the pungent truth head-on. Homes were often small, overcrowded, and poorly ventilated. When someone died, their body might remain in the house for days before burial. Without refrigeration or embalming, decomposition began almost immediately, releasing a powerful odor that could permeate everything. Candles, especially those made with fragrant beeswax or infused with herbs, were burned constantly in the rooms of the dead. These were not just spiritual symbols, but olfactory shields meant to overpower or at least dull the scent of death. In churches and noble homes, The rich sometimes burned expensive incense like frankincense and myrrh, drawing on ancient traditions that linked aroma with sanctity. But in the homes of commoners, simple candles were the first and last defense. The flame flickered over the faces of mourners not just as a solemn tribute, but as a practical measure to create some comfort in unbearable conditions. During plagues or wartime, when death was a constant companion, the smell of burning tallow or war wax became permanently associated with loss and mourning. Even graveyards, often located beside churches in the center of towns, could exude a foul odor, especially when bodies were buried shallowly or the land was overused. Candles were also carried by undertakers and clergy, not just to light the way, but to bring a little dignity and a better smell to grim surroundings. This practice reminds us how deeply intertwined sensory experience and cultural ritual were. In a world that lacked sanitation and advanced medicine, people used what they had: fire, herbs, and wax. What we consider comforting candlelight today was once a desperate attempt to hold back the stench of death. And in that effort, we glimpse the resilience of people who lived with mortality every day, lighting candles not only for the dead but for the living who remained behind to endure. 41. The power of wind, medieval air freshener. In the medieval world, before the invention of modern hygiene or chemical air fresheners, the simplest forces of nature often held the greatest power. One such force was the wind. The movement of air, though invisible, became one of the most relied upon methods to combat the heavy, persistent odors of daily life. Streets teemed with waste, both human and animal, thrown casually out of windows or left to rot in gutters. Homes, often shared with livestock or constructed with little thought for ventilation, became dense with the mingled smells of sweat, smoke, food, illness, and decay. In this thick atmosphere, a gust of wind blowing through a window, across a field, or down a street was more than a breeze, it was a cleansing gift. In castles and manor houses, where latrines were often built projecting over the walls, architects took advantage of elevation. They designed openings called garderobes that used gravity and wind to carry away waste and its smell. Towers were positioned to catch prevailing breezes, and windows were placed strategically to encourage cross-ventilation. In monasteries, where quiet and cleanliness were valued, cloisters and corridors were intentionally built around open courtyards, allowing fresh air to circulate. For the poor, who had no luxury of architecture or design, a sudden shift in weather, cool wind from the hills, or a change in season was enough to lift spirits and offer relief from the heavy stink of survival. Wind was also used to dry and air out clothing and bedding, both of which rarely saw soap. Housewives would hang laundry high on poles or bushes, relying on the sun and wind to strip away not only moisture but odor. Even in cities, cloths and rugs were beaten and left to air, since washing was costly and labor-intensive. On feast days or holy days, people opened their windows to allow the clean air to replace what had become stale inside. During outbreaks of disease, some even believed that wind carried away miasmas, the invisible poisonous vapors blamed for illness. This reliance on wind reveals something essential about medieval life. Without the technology to sanitize their world, people turned to nature's beer. The wind was not simply air in motion, it was health, relief, and at times, the only ally against the daily tide of filth. Today, we flip a switch or spray a bottle to freshen our surroundings. But back then, they opened a window and waited, hoping the breeze would do what soap and science could not. It's a humbling reminder that what we often overlook, the breath of the world, was once a precious resource, respected not for what it was seen to be, but for what it helped people endure. 42. Drinking water from the same river used as a sewer in medieval towns and villages. The river was the lifeline of the community. It provided water for cooking, washing, drinking, bathing, irrigating crops, and even powering mills. But in a cruel twist of necessity and ignorance, it also served as the town's sewer. Human waste, animal entrails from butcher shops, garbage from taverns, dye runoff from tanneries, and the uncollected refuse of daily life were all cast into the same waters from which people drank. The same bucket that a mother used to draw water for her child's soup may have been filled downstream from a latrine, a slaughterhouse, or a laundry rinsing foul rags. What seemed like an innocent daily chore was, in fact, a slow act of poisoning. People in the Middle Ages had little understanding of waterborne disease. The concept of germs was centuries away, and illness was blamed on bad air, sin, or divine punishment. The river, flowing and beautiful on the surface, was believed to be continually refreshed by its movement, capable of washing away all impurities simply by moving it further downstream. There were, of course, those who noticed that certain areas or wells caused sickness more frequently, but lacking the knowledge to connect waste with disease, many continued their habits generation after generation. In larger cities like London or Paris, the situation grew dire as populations swelled. The Thames and the Seine became noxious streams of sewage, yet people still gathered at their banks to fetch water or wash clothing. Wealthier citizens might import water from cleaner springs or pay for carriers to bring water from less polluted sources, but the poor, which made up the vast majority, had no such choice. Children died young and outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid swept through cities with terrifying regularity. People knew their lives were hard, but they didn't always know why. And yet, within this filth and hardship, humanity endured. Efforts were made, however misguided, to purify the water. Boiling was sometimes practiced not out of scientific awareness, but as part of soup making or tea preparation. Herbal infusions were used, both for flavor and believed medicinal value. Town councils, albeit inconsistently, began to restrict dumping in certain areas. Over time, awareness grew, and eventually the need for clean water systems became undeniable. Looking back, it's almost unimaginable to conceive of drinking from a river swirling with filth. But this was the reality of survival in the Middle Ages. The same water that nourished also brought death. It is a sobering reflection on how far we've come and a reminder of the silent miracles of modern sanitation. What we now take for granted clean water from a tap was once a daily gamble with fate. And through the lens of history, the river becomes not just a symbol of ignorance, but a testament to resilience, to the instinct to survive even when the odds flowed against you. 43. Life of a medieval sewer cleaner in the shadows beneath the cobbled streets and castle walls of medieval towns lived a group of men whose work was as essential as it was reviled, the sewer cleaners. They were known by many names: gong farmers in England or fossoyeurs in parts of France, but their task remained universally grim. By day they were invisible, outcast from polite society. By night they descended into the underworld of medieval sanitation, scraping, hauling, and shoveling the filth of the city, one bucket at a time. These workers were tasked with cleaning out the cesspits, privy vaults, and underground latrines that sat beneath homes, monasteries, and even royal castles. Without them, waste would pile up, overflowing into streets and drinking water sources. Their labor prevented plagues, disease, and unbearable stench from completely overtaking the urban centers, and yet they were paid little and respected even less. Many lived on the fringes of town, physically and socially, and were often barred from entering churches or marketplaces. The very people whose lives depended on their work would turn away in disgust if they passed them on the street. The job itself was nightmarish. Clad in rudimentary leather aprons or old tunics, and armed with wooden shovels, iron rakes, and carts, sewer cleaners would lower themselves into pits filled with human excrement, rotting food, and maggot-infested waste. The air was thick and poisonous. There was no protection from infection or toxic fumes. Some carried cloth soaked in vinegar to their faces, hoping it might ward off disease, or at least blunt the odor. But for many, the stench clung permanently to their bodies, clothes, and homes. Despite the horror of the job, it required skill. A good sewer cleaner knew the layout of subterranean systems and could work efficiently and quietly, often by lantern light. They had to be strong, able to lift heavy buckets of waste, and brave enough to crawl into confined, dangerous spaces. Some cities employed them on rotation, while others hired them only in emergencies, when cesspits threatened to overflow or when noble visitors were expected and the stench needed urgent concealment. There are stories of cleaners who fell ill or even died in the sewers, suffocated by gas or buried in collapsing walls of waste. And yet, others managed to rise economically, gaining small wealth and property due to the high demand and lack of competition for such an abhorred profession. A few became minor legends, recognized not for their valor, but for their endurance in the face of a life that most would flee from in terror. Reflecting on the life of a medieval sewer cleaner is not simply an exercise in horror, it's a lesson in humility. We live in an age of hidden infrastructure. Waste disappears with the flush of a button, and sanitation workers are rarely seen, let alone thanked. But in medieval times, filth was visible, and someone had to deal with it. These unsung heroes labored in the most miserable conditions, so that others might live slightly more comfortably. They were the backbone of urban hygiene long before science caught up to explain why their work mattered. Their story reminds us that civilization isn't built only by kings and scholars, it's also built by those willing to wade through the worst of life so others don't have to. The sewer cleaner of the Middle Ages, though unnamed in most history books, played a role more vital than many a knight or noble. In their darkness and disgrace, they upheld the very foundation of public health. And that, in its own grim way, is a kind of honor. 44. No one knew what bacteria were in the medieval world. Unseen forces ruled daily life: spirits, humors, curses, and divine punishment. What people could not see, they often feared or ignored. And among the most dangerous of the invisible killers were bacteria, though no one knew they existed. The concept of microorganisms was centuries away. The microscope had yet to be invented. Germ theory was a distant dream. And so people lived and died surrounded by pathogens they could neither detect nor understand. When plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, wiping out millions, explanations ranged from the wrath of God to the alignment of the planets. People blamed bad air, the sins of their neighbors, or the corruption of outsiders. They burned incense to purify the atmosphere, carried herbs around their necks, or fled to the countryside in terror. But they did not boil water. They did not wash their hands. They did not disinfect wounds. Because the very idea that disease could be spread by invisible life forms lurking in water, blood, or filth had not yet entered the human mind. Doctors, learned men of their age, diagnosed illness by examining urine color or listening to the balance of bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Bleeding, purging, and prayer were the standard treatments. In hospitals, the sick were grouped together in crowded halls, sometimes placed side by side with open sores and infected bandages, with no understanding that close contact might cause pollens to spread. Surgeons reused knives and dressings. Midwives went from one birth to another with unwashed hands. The concept of sterility simply did not exist. Perhaps the most tragic irony of medieval medicine was its confidence. People believed they understood the body, believed in leeches and star charts, and placed their faith in ancient texts. But they were at war with an invisible enemy whose existence they could not even imagine. A farmer who drank from a stream downstream of a latrine, a nobleman who bathed in stagnant water, or a soldier who pressed soil into an open wound all suffered the consequences of bacterial infection yet blamed it in bad luck or bad air. And yet humans survived. Through trial and error, some traditions emerged that incidentally helped. Wine or vinegar was used to clean wounds. Herbs with antibacterial properties were applied unknowingly. Isolation during plague outbreaks, while based on superstition, sometimes succeeded. But until the invention of the microscope in the 17th century, and the work of scientists like Antony van Leeuwenhoek, Pasteur, and Koch much later, the true enemy remained hidden in plain sight. Looking back, it's easy to judge medieval people for their ignorance, but it is more fitting to admire their resilience. They endured without understanding, fought illness without science, and cared for the sick with what little they had. Their world was dirtier, more dangerous, and filled with suffering, but they kept going. The story of bacteria is not just the tale of invisible death, but of humanity's long, slow march toward knowledge. And in that there is hope. For even in the darkest ages, the quest to understand the unseen never fully disappeared, it only awaited the right lens. 45. Smelling bad was a status symbol. In the world of medieval Europe, personal hygiene was not simply a matter of health or comfort, it was a reflection of culture, class, and power. While modern sensibilities recoil at the idea, there was a time when smelling bad was not only common, it was a status symbol. Among the nobility and wealthy elite, to reek of unwashed bodies, old garments, and heavy perfumes was not considered shameful. On the contrary, it was an olfactory declaration of privilege. For the medieval noble, daily labor was for peasants. Physical cleanliness was sometimes associated with manual work and lower-class necessity. A person who worked in the fields or spent time outdoors might bathe to remove grime, mud, and sweat. But for the elite, who were confined to castle halls, draped in layers of velvet and brocade, bathing was viewed with suspicion. There were prevailing beliefs that hot water could weaken the body or open the pores to disease. Others considered the exposure of the nude fawn during a bath immodest or morally dangerous. Instead of washing, nobles opted for masking odors with oils, rosewater, and heavy perfume, which often created an even more pungent, overwhelming effect. The wardrobe of a wealthy lord or lady only added to the smell. Outfits were worn repeatedly without washing, sometimes for weeks. Laundering clothing was laborious and expensive, and since clothing was a marker of wealth, its preservation was prioritized over cleanliness. Underlayers soaked up sweat and were rarely changed, while outer garments heavy with embroidery, fur, and silk trapped every scent of the human body. Ironically, the poor were often cleaner than the rich. Though they had fewer clothes, they were more likely to wash them. Though they lived in harsher conditions, they might bathe in rivers or communal bathhouses more often when the church permitted it. But they did not possess the luxury of reeking without consequence. Smelling bad was not a sign of freedom, it was simply unpleasant. Only the wealthy could afford to stink without shame. This belief extended to notions of piety and superiority. Some aristocrats viewed the rejection of regular bathing as a virtue. To refuse indulgence, to endure discomfort, was thought to reflect strength of character or closeness to God. It also conveniently distinguished the upper class from those who had no choice but to clean themselves after days of laboring in filth. Yet in truth, the noble stench was anything but noble. Castles stank of chamber pots, rotting food, and stale sweat. Layers of perfume could not hide the truth of unwashed bodies. Visitors often complained of the oppressive odors that clung to hallways and feasting rooms. Even royalty, with access to private bath chambers and servants, seldom bathed. It was not until the Enlightenment and the slow emergence of germ theory centuries later that the rich began to rediscover the value of cleanliness. Looking back, this peculiar inversion of cleanliness and status reminds us how culture shapes perception. What we now find repulsive was once aspirational. It is a sobering reminder that privilege can blind people not only to discomfort but to common sense. Smelling bad as a sign of wealth reveals more than just medieval hygiene. It shows how deeply status can warp even the most basic aspects of life. And it leaves us wondering, in what ways might we today be clinging to customs that future generations will find just as absurd? 46. Rats, roaches, and nighttime guests. As night fell upon a medieval village or castle, a peculiar shift occurred. The world outside grew quiet, but inside, a different kind of life stirred, unseen, unwanted, and deeply familiar. Rats scurried through the shadows, their claws clicking softly on the stone floors. Roaches emerged from the cracks in wooden beams and thatched ceilings. These creatures were not the exception in medieval homes, they were the norm. Every night they became the uninvited guests who shared beds, pantries, and hearths with humans, making themselves at home in the filth and disorder that defined much of medieval life. The presence of rats and roaches was tied closely to the structure of medieval buildings. Poorly ventilated, damp, and dimly lit, these homes were a haven for vermin. Straw used for bedding and insulation quickly became a breeding ground for fleas, lice, and cockroaches. Food scraps were rarely cleaned up. Crumbs lingered in corners and under furniture, while storage techniques were primitive at best. Grain was often kept in wooden bins or cloth sacks which rats could chew through easily. In wealthier homes, kitchens and storage rooms were overstocked, making them even more attractive to pests. In castles, waste disposal was inefficient, often involving dumping refuse out of windows into moats or alleys, creating more feeding grounds for rats. Perhaps the most disturbing reality was the way people simply accepted this nightly invasion. Children grew up swatting away fleas before sleep. Adults stuffed cloth into wall cracks in a futile attempt to deter rodents. Cats were a partial solution and were often welcomed for their ability to kill rats, but they were not nearly enough. Roaches thrived in dark, moist places like under beds and near cooking fires. It was not uncommon to wake in the middle of the night and feel something crawling on your skin, only to swat it away and roll over without much alarm. That was just life. Rats in particular were far more than a nuisance, they were deadly. They thrived in crowded towns and followed human populations wherever they settled. When the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 14th century, rats and their fleece played a critical role in spreading the plague. But at the time, people didn't understand this connection. They thought illness came from bad air, moral failing, or divine punishment, not from the fleas hiding in the fur of rodents beneath their beds. Even royal chambers were not immune. Though draped in fine tapestries and guarded by servants, these spaces still lacked basic sanitation. Straw on the floors was rarely changed. Beds were shared, not only by nobles and their families, but by fleas, lice, and the occasional rat-drawn warmth and food scraps. Guests visiting such places often commented, sometimes with horror, on the level of filth and infestation they witnessed. The deeper truth behind these nighttime guests is this: the boundary between man and pest was frighteningly thin. Without modern hygiene, pest control, or knowledge of disease, medieval people lived in constant, intimate proximity with creatures we now desperately avoid. And yet they carried on, adapting in silence, their expectations dulled by generations of shared discomfort. Reflecting on this, one realizes how relative human standards truly are. Today, the thought of a single roach can cause panic. In the past, dozens might crawl beneath one's pillow unnoticed. That contrast does not merely show how far we've come, it reminds us how much suffering can be normalized. And while we may never again share our sleeping quarters with rats or roaches, the lesson lingers. Complacency in the face of filth, whether physical or societal, can make even the most intolerable conditions feel like home. 47. Monastery cleanliness, a story of silence and smell hidden behind tall stone walls, and surrounded by quiet gardens. Medieval monasteries were often viewed as places of peace, discipline, and divine pursuit. Within these cloisters, monks lived structured, sacred lives defined by prayer, labor, and silence. But while their souls were dedicated to purity, the physical reality of their surroundings often told a different story, especially when it came to cleanliness. The monastery, though orderly in its rituals and devotions, was not immune to the medieval world's struggles with hygiene, and its story is one of contradictions: silence paired with smell, discipline tangled with dirt. Life in a medieval monastery followed a strict schedule. Monks awoke before dawn to chant prayers, worked in the gardens or scriptoria during the day, and returned to the chapel for services several times before dusk. Most monasteries adhered to the rule of St. Benedict, which emphasized humility, communal living, and manual labor. However, despite the emphasis on inner cleanliness and simplicity, outer cleanliness often fell by the wayside, not always out of neglect, but out of belief. Many monks believed that bodily suffering or discomfort brought them closer to spiritual enlightenment. Regular bathing was not only seen as unnecessary but potentially sinful, associated with vanity and pleasure. In fact, some orders allowed only a few baths per year, typically before major religious festivals. In this way, smell became a kind of spiritual badge, proof of a monk's rejection of earthly indulgence. In the absence of frequent washing, monks turned to other practices. Ash and sand were sometimes used to scrub the skin. Hair and beards grew long, rarely trimmed. Habits: those simple woolen robes were seldom washed and could carry the scent of sweat, earth, and age-old incense for years. Inside the dormitories, rows of narrow beds stood side by side, with straw mattresses that were only changed occasionally. The smell of mildew, sweat, and the damp stone walls became familiar, almost sacred, as monks rarely spoke of such discomforts aloud. Silence reigned not only in prayer but in suffering. The latrines, often located in outbuildings or built as overhanging structures called garderobes, offered little reprieve. Shared by many and cleaned infrequently, they were breeding grounds for disease and foul odors. In some monasteries, monks were required to relieve themselves quickly and quietly, following a set time each day. Hygiene was a matter of discipline, not comfort. Despite the challenges, the monastery represented a higher order of living. Cleanliness, in the spiritual sense, was about purification of the soul, not the skin. A monk could be covered in dirt but still feel wholly devoted. And paradoxically, that devotion created a certain serenity even when the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and smoky candles. Yet, from a modern lens, one must pause and consider how suffering was sometimes mistaken for virtue, and how the absence of physical care was viewed as a moral strength. Monastic life, with all its beauty and spiritual richness, was also filled with hardship that could have been lessened without compromising faith. In this reflection lies a powerful lesson. Cleanliness should not be treated as vanity, nor should physical neglect be a pathway to enlightenment. True purity, whether of soul or body, requires balance. The monks, in their silent devotion, teach us the value of discipline and purpose. But their story also cautions us: when silence becomes a shield for suffering and smell becomes a silent companion to faith, it is time to reconsider the boundaries between spiritual and physical well-being. 48. Miasma. When bad air was blamed for disease long before the world came to understand bacteria or viruses, humanity sought to explain the invisible causes of disease. In medieval times and well into the 19th century, one theory reigned supreme: miasma. It was not an organism that people feared, but the very air they breathed, thick, foul, and corrupted by decay. This belief that bad smells carried illness shaped entire cities, informed laws, dictated public health policies, and led to some of the most dramatic and sometimes tragic responses to outbreaks. The story of miasma is one of fear, misunderstanding, and the desperate human need to make sense of suffering. The word miasma comes from the Greek, meaning pollution or stain, and it referred to the idea that disease spread through poisonous vapor rising from rotting organic matter. A swamp, a heap of refuse, a body left too long unburied, these were thought to exhale invisible clouds of sickness. A foul smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was a warning. Entire communities recoiled from the stench, not only with disgust but with dread, convinced that death floated on the breeze. During outbreaks of plague or cholera, the panic over miasma reached fever pitch. In 14th century Europe, when the Black Death swept across the continent, many believed the plague came from the foul, corrupted air stirred by earthquakes or cosmic disturbances. People wore beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs to filter the air, not to protect against germs of which they had no knowledge but to keep the poisonous odors at bay. Bonfires of incense were lit in the streets, rooms were fumigated with smoke, and perfumes became a tool of survival as much as vanity. City planners, guided by the miasma theory, attempted to design streets with wider avenues and more open air. Some reforms were indeed beneficial, encouraging better ventilation and even waste management. But the motivation was not rooted in science, it was born of fear. Poor neighborhoods, often overcrowded and reeking of human waste, were blamed for spreading disease not because of their sanitary conditions, but because of their sorry smells. This led to deep social stigma, reinforcing class divisions under the guise of public health. Ironically, the miasma theory was both wrong and in a strange way right. The smells themselves did not cause disease, but they often pointed to the unsanitary conditions that did. In that sense, the theory misidentified the culprit but observed its effects correctly. Dirty water, decomposing waste, and poor drainage systems, these were indeed the breeding grounds for deadly pathogens, but people lacked the tools to see them. Instead, they listened to their noses. As scientific understanding evolved in the 19th century, the work of pioneers like John Snow began to challenge miasma. During a cholera outbreak in London, he traced the disease to a contaminated water pump, proving that it was not the air, but the water that carried death. Yet even as germ theory took hold, the idea of miasma clung stubbornly to public belief. It had become more than a medical theory. It was part of the culture, the architecture of fear that had stood for centuries. In reflecting on the age of miasma, one must admire the deep desire people had to understand their world, to name and battle the unseen. But it also serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of ignorance dressed in certainty. Lives were lost, people were blamed, and progress was delayed because the scent of disease was mistaken for its source. Today we have microscopes and antibiotics, vaccines and sewage systems, but the legacy of miasma lingers in the language we use and the instincts we follow. We still associate bad smells with danger, filth with illness, and clean air with health. In many ways, those medieval instincts weren't entirely misguided, they were just incomplete. The story of miasma is not just about medieval medicine, it's about the human condition. We fear what we cannot see. We try to make sense of suffering, and we build beliefs around what little we know. It teaches us to be humble in the face of the unknown and cautious when certainty outpaces evidence. Because sometimes the real danger lies not in the air we breathe, but in the ideas we hold without question. 49. Why you wouldn't last a day in medieval hygiene. Imagine waking up in a wooden cottage where the scent of damp straw mixes with the sharp tang of unwashed bodies. The sun barely peeks through the cracks in the walls, and outside, the sound of chamber pots being emptied out of windows onto the streets is your morning alarm. You stumble out of bed, not into a bathroom, for such a room does not exist, but toward a bucket in the corner, perhaps shared with others in the household. If you are lucky, there's some cold water in a bowl from the night before. Soap is a luxury item, and even if you had it, people in your village might warn you that too much washing could make you sick. After all, the theory of humours dominates medical thinking, and exposing your pores to water might emit disease through the skin. Most medieval people believe bad air miasma is the source of illness, not filth. Stepping into the street, you try to avoid the piles of waste, animal droppings, and refuse rotting underfoot. Rats scurry between the buildings, and fleas jump with ease from animal to human. The stench is overwhelming, a nauseating blend of dung, decay, and sweat. No one flinches, because this is the scent of daily life. If you're a servant or peasant, bathing is almost unheard of. If you're a monk, perhaps your vows of humility extend to avoiding bodily pleasures like warm water. If you're wealthy, you might own a bathhouse or have servants to heat water, but even then, such indulgences are rare, reserved for special occasions or illnesses. As the day progresses, you grow used to the biting smell of your own body and those around you. Clothes are rarely washed, and undergarments are often absent. Your hands are stained with soil or soot, and nails are blackened from daily labor. You visit a local healer for a wound, and instead of antiseptic, she sprinkles ash or wine on the gash, muttering prayer to saints, hoping for divine intervention. A nearby river provides drinking water, but it's the same river where butchers clean carcasses, tanners dump chemicals, and waste flows freely. The idea of boiling water is unknown, and your stomach churns from things you can't see, bacteria no one yet knows exist. By nightfall, the air thickens with candle smoke and unventilated sweat. There are no toothbrushes, no deodorant, no sanitary systems. The only thing worse than the physical discomfort is knowing this life isn't exceptional, it's the norm for everyone around you. Your skin itches from lice, and your bedding rustles not only with straw, but with unseen insects. You drift off to sleep amidst a cloud of pungency that you can no longer distinguish. This is hygiene in the Middle Ages, not an inconvenience, but a constant, suffocating reality. And so, in reflecting on this grim daily existence, we come to a truth that history often masks beneath armor and stained glass. The human experience of the past was not only shaped by war, faith, and power, but also by odor, grime, and suffering. The filth wasn't just environmental, it was systemic, rooted in beliefs, limitations, and the very structure of medieval life. To live in such a world was to endure discomfort as a baseline. Modern luxuries like soap, running water, flushing toilets, and antiseptics are not trivial. They are triumphs of progress. When we romanticize the past, we risk forgetting that even a single day in medieval hygiene meant she might have broken our modern tolerance. What was once endured with stoicism now reminds us why progress, though imperfect, is a gift we should never take for granted. Looking back on the 49 stories of medieval hygiene, one truth becomes painfully clear. Life in the Middle Ages was not just harsh, it was filthy, uncomfortable, and often dangerously unsanitary. Hygiene, as we know it today, was practically non-existent, not because people didn't care, but because they lacked the knowledge, tools, and infrastructure to do better. Disease thrived in filth, myths replaced medicine, and even the wealthiest couldn't escape the stench of everyday life. Yet in their resilience, medieval people survived and laid the foundation for the health revolutions to come. These stories aren't meant to disgust, but to remind us of how far we've come and how easily those hard-earned comforts can be forgotten or taken for granted. Clean water, soap, sewers, and science are not just modern conveniences, they are milestones of human progress. And perhaps, after reading these tales, we'll see the next hot shower not as routine, but as a quiet victory over the grime of history.